Okay, good afternoon or good evening, or I'm not sure, we have good morning for some people as well on other sides of the world. Thank you all for being here again. It's great to see you. People are streaming in and out as was the case yesterday. So, yeah, we'll proceed. Everybody's here to start the session. Just 2 points I wanted to clarify before we start. The first one is on questions. Yesterday there was a little bit of confusion on the questions, but there is a separate Q&A chat in the Zoom. When you have your mouse and you go on the bottom, you see Q&A. So we prefer if you put your questions in the Q&A chat. So if you have any questions, please use that one instead of the chat, the normal chat, which you can say hi to people with and also contact people individually. But let's try and use the Q&A chat for the Q&A. And the other announcement I wanted to make is that before we start is that the book that was launched yesterday is now done, and it is available online. I'm going to give you the link in the chat right now where you can download it. This is the e-versions, and the paper versions we'll have separately. But with that, I want to hand over to start the first session. So I'm going to hand over to the moderator, who's Kate Phillips, who will introduce herself and also introduce the panelists. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome everybody. Great to be here after such a fascinating session yesterday. I'm Kate Phillips. I'm the program lead on the Presidential Employment Stimulus in South Africa. And I'm delighted to be moderating this session because actually the issues that it deals with, I think, are really important and underexplored dimensions of policy in relation to public employment programs. In this first session, the critical issue is looking at the non-income dimensions of participation in work and the meaning that that has for people. Now, when evaluations of public employment programs take place, often it is quite hard to disentangle the income effects from other effects of participation in work. That's particularly the case in contexts like my own, where there is not social protection for the unemployed that would deal with the loss of income from loss of employment or lack of employment. And so untangling the importance that participation in work has for people over and above the income effects is a really important area of study, and both of the papers today speak in different ways and fascinating ways to this issue. So we have two speakers. We have Reshman Hussam and Victoria Basurto. We will start with Reshman. So I will introduce her first and introduce Victoria later. We have 20 minutes for presentation, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So Reshman is Assistant Professor of Business Administration for the Harvard Business School. Her work focuses at the intersection of development, behavioral economics, and health economics. And she's currently doing work with refugees across a spectrum of issues, including the Rohingya. And her paper provides a fascinating insight into precisely the topic of this session. So delighted to have you here today, and over to you, Reshman.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Kate, for that introduction. Thank you for having me. As Kate described, I am excited to present a recent paper. Let me just quickly share my screen. All right. Entitled The Psychosocial Value of Employment, in which we investigate this question in the context of the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. And this is work that is very much co-authored with Aaron Kelly, who's at the World Bank, Greg Lane at American University, and Fatima Zahra at NYU. Okay, so let me just launch right in. I'd like to first ground us in some context. So here, what you see is the Nath River. And if you are standing on this side, the Bangladesh side, in August of 2017, You would have noticed smoke rising from behind those mountains across the river, which came from villages that were set ablaze by the Myanmar military in this massive ethnic cleansing campaign, now understood by many to be a genocide of the Rohingya minority. What resulted from that campaign was the exodus of 750 to 800,000 Rohingya refugees who crossed the border and built and settled into what is now the largest refugee camp in the world. So here's one such family, one Rohingya family. Now, a few things to note. First is that both of these individuals, the two adults, the mother and the father, would have likely been eligible for our interventions, including our employment program that I'll describe to you in a bit. They are men and women of working age. Second, they're standing in front of their shack, their bamboo and tarpaulin shack, which they likely share with at least one other family, given the size. And if you were to enter inside that shack, you would notice that it is extremely sparsely appointed. There's maybe a mat to sleep on, a few water jugs, a cooking pot, and not much else. And that's because, of course, they left all of their possessions, all their belongings in Myanmar during the brutal cleansing episode where they had to flee with nothing. Third, if you were to walk down this narrow, muddy pathway to your left, you would notice first many children playing, and you would notice that the adults are either, perhaps the men are sitting at tea stalls chatting with other men, perhaps standing around their shacks, and often the women are just sitting inside their shacks, often doing nothing. And if you were to go to one of these adults and ask them, how can I be useful? How can I help you? They would be likely to say some combination of the following two things: help us go back home and give us work. So we have another project that explores this deep desire to go back home despite the genocide. But today I want to talk to you about this request to give us work. Now, it might not be so surprising to you, right? As I said, they left everything in Myanmar. Perhaps they need work because they need the income to rebuild their lives, right? But the interesting thing is that they use this term, hatir kaj, which colloquially in Bengali means handiwork, so something the women might do. And yet the men are using this word too. And very literally it means to work with my hands, to do something with my hands. So it's these sorts of conversations that make us think, or that made us think, that the phenomenon of people just standing around doing nothing is not one of choice. It's indeed one of circumstance, right? And we see widespread unemployment in these areas. Number one, because it's illegal to work. Refugees are not legally allowed to work in Bangladesh. Second, they are kind of contained within these camps. There are checkpoints, so it's very hard to go into the nearby town or city to find informal work. And third, there's also very few opportunities for informal work within the camp. So within our own sample, only 11% of our sample report having had any work in the month prior to our intervention. And of those who had any work, it was only 3 days of work. Okay, so very little, few opportunities for work. And so this is what motivates the question in this study, which is, what is the value of employment beyond its direct monetary benefit on well-being? And of course, we're building on an enormous literature. There's a long tradition in the social sciences that explores this question of the non-pecuniary benefits to employment, both in sociology and psychology, as well as some recent lab in the field experiments. But we hope that this project can perhaps address a few of the challenges that we see as critical to the existing literature. First is selection, right? That when you compare unemployed individuals to employed people to look at their happiness level, for example, unemployed individuals may be different in ways that are systematically correlated with that outcome of mental health or psychosocial well-being. Second, if you're able to get out of that, so for example, if you can look at an exogenous employment shock such that it's essentially random who became unemployed or not, you still conflate those two mechanisms that Kate was describing at the beginning, which is that when you have a job, not only do you have the colleagues and the identity as a worker, et cetera, but of course you also have the income, and both of those things impact well-being. So how do you tease those two apart? And finally, we're trying to build off of the existing lab in the field experiments by offering kind of a more realistic form of employment and a more realistic outside option to make that trade-off more meaningful. Okay, so what do? We work with 745 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. It's a very simple randomized control trial. Okay, so we randomize one set of them into a control group where they get no work and a very small, nominal fee for weekly survey participation. Then there's a cash group that also gets no work and a much larger cash fee for weekly survey participation. And finally, there's a work group who receives paid wage labor that is equivalent weekly to the amount the cash group is getting. Okay, and importantly, it's 8 weeks of employment, which in a context where only 11% of individuals get work at all, 3 days per month at best, 8 weeks seems like a meaningful long duration form of employment. And just a quick preview of results before I delve into the details, we find that work leads to substantial improvements in well-being and psychosocial well-being. And these improvements are significantly different from that of cash alone, which surprisingly in our context has very limited psychosocial impact, which suggests that work has quite large non-pecuniary psychosocial benefits. We find that in an incentivized labor supply elicitation exercise that I'll describe in a bit, those who are offered work are willing, in fact, to forego cash payments that are almost equivalent to their baseline savings. So they're willing to give up quite a bit of liquidity, quite a bit of money, simply to continue to working without pay, which suggests that they are internalizing or valuing this psychosocial dimension of employment. And finally, we find some suggestive evidence that these differential effects of work on top of cash are concentrated among men. This last point I'm likely not going to be able to get to, but I do encourage you, if you're interested, to refer to the paper where we explore a bunch of different kind of dimensions of the worker and of the work that might be impacting the results that we find. Okay, so broadly, what's the context? At first, the context is the 30 million refugees globally of the 82 million forcibly displaced persons globally. Being a refugee is not a temporary phenomenon. Being a forcibly displaced person is not a temporary phenomenon. So we shouldn't expect this to go away on its own. We have to kind of address the system and the environment that they find themselves in for quite a long time. Notably, 70% of refugees face restrictions in the right to work, and that's notwithstanding the 30% who may be legally allowed to work, but of course face enormous informal barriers to entering the labor market. And many of these individuals are suffering from trauma, PTSD, just like ours. And just to illustrate the point, here you see a Syrian refugee in a Turkish camp that is known to be the materially best equipped camp in the world. And they say, we wake up, we sleep, we wake up, we sleep, we eat food. There's no purpose in a life like this. One day is like another. So signaling to the possible value that engagement in productive activity which is what we think of as employment, might play in the well-being of individuals. Now, of course, we're here in this session. We hope that this work will speak to a set of people far beyond refugees, but I just want to kind of be conservative in the implications for now. So you have a sense of who we're working with in our context of the Rohingya refugees. The average individual is going to be a male who is younger than the age of 30 and married, although we have 30% women in our sample. They have in their savings about $4 US dollars, and they're borrowing 10 times as much, which suggests that they are indeed quite cash constrained. They are also, for lack of a better word, perhaps well-being constrained. You can see that 40% of the individuals in our sample qualify in our kind of depression screening tool as moderately to severely depressed, which is perhaps most powerfully illustrated in the fact that nearly 50% of individuals in our sample express having had suicidal thoughts in the previous 2 weeks. Now, while these are grim statistics, they're also, in fact, not unusual. The few other studies that have looked at psychological well-being among refugees have found this similar statistics for Syrian refugees in Jordan, and notably the Hispanic or Latinx community in the US during COVID 2020 and the peak of unemployment also had similar rates of depression. So again, to speak to a broader audience than even just refugees. Okay, so as I said, the design is quite simple. Let me just highlight the point of the design. We have a control group who we compare to the cash group to elicit the psychosocial value of cash, right? All our outcomes, our main outcomes will be psychosocial. I'll describe them in a bit. And then we can use that as a benchmark against which to compare the psychosocial value of work, which we get from comparing the cash group to the cash for work group, okay? Now, just so you have a sense of what the cash means, control individuals get 50 taka per week. That's about 70 cents on the dollar per week. And cash for work groups get quite a lot relative to their daily consumption. So it's $60 PPP. And it's, I think most relevantly, substantially higher than the reliable amount of rations they get per day in oil, lentils, and rice. So you should think about it as at least equivalent to their daily consumption. And of course, it's double what you would get if you were lucky enough to get any employment at all. If you are lucky enough to get any employment at all, it's about 300 taka per day, 3 days per month. So what we're offering is about double that. Okay, so it's quite a bit of money in this context. Now, how about the employment intervention? Now, of course, there's many employment interventions one could design. Our goal was to design a context-appropriate intervention that included the key features of work. Okay, so it's an effortful task in attention and energy. It's a time substitute for leisure, so it takes time away from engaging in leisure activities. That's a nod to the labor-leisure trade-off in economic theory. It's of some meaningful duration. It has some nominal social component and some nominal purposeful component, which I will just describe. So now imagine, so this is how we describe the work test to somebody. So imagine here you are a Rohingya refugee. I'm going to tell you, imagine the things you do during the day. Now imagine 15 neighbors of yours, 15 male neighbors in this case, and think about what they're doing during the day. Now I'd like you to go out 4 times a day, and you can see the sun, the location of the sun, determining the time of day. Go out 4 times a day and just tally what these 15 individuals are doing. I don't need to know their names. I don't need to know who they are. We just want a sense of how individuals are operating in the camps. Now here is basically an exhaustive.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh, I thought it was 8. Okay, then I will really go quickly. So we do it through these visual timesheets. So, and then we have individuals submit their work at the end of each day to make sure we're holding them accountable for daily work, okay? You should think of this job as something that is neither too good nor too bad in the context of the camps. You wanted to make something that was, that Goldilocks perfection in the setting of the Rohingya refugee camps. Now, in my remaining few minutes, let me just get to the results. So our main results is that across a host of pre-specified psychosocial measures, we find substantial improvements to the psychosocial well-being of employed individuals. So this is the psychosocial index, which is a combination of these pre-specified measures. The PHQ is our screening tool we use for depression. A lower PHQ score means less likelihood of depression. These are all in standard deviations. So you see lower stress, increased life satisfaction, increased sociability, increased self-worth, greater sense of control, and greater sense of security or stability. So that's result number 1. Result number 2 is that the difference between work and cash, which you can get from this test between work and cash, is large and significant. Okay, so we can confidently reject that work has an equivalent effect to cash. In fact, it has a substantially larger effect. And finally, the cash treatment alone, which recall was quite large given daily consumption, we can't reject that it has a 0 impact on psychosocial well-being, although we can also not reject that it has a 0.1 standard deviation impact. Okay, so that's the headline result. We find large non-pecuniary value, psychosocial value to work. Interestingly, this also translates to other outcomes you might be interested in. So individuals who are working report being sick far fewer days than cash individuals. Again, look at this test between the two. They also exhibit a much stronger cognitive index, which is a summary of kind of memory tests and basic arithmetic tests, which is quite surprising. And finally, they also exhibit a substantially less risk aversion. So it seems that the employment, even beyond the cash itself, seems to offer individuals some sort of psychological stability or security, such that insurance, such that they can feel ready to take risks. Okay, I think I just have a minute left. So let me just go to, I think, what is quite an interesting.
You can have a few more minutes, Reshma, and I don't mean to rush you on duty.
Okay, oh, no. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Kate. So, so we've shown that we can measure these psychosocial impacts, but the next question is, do these individuals internalize the psychosocial impacts? So what we do is we elicit individuals. Well, here's exactly what we do. At the end of the 8 weeks, we come to the workers, the individuals in the work treatment, and we say, we have a little bit of money left. We'd like to complete some more work. Would you be willing to work for us for 1 more week? We don't have enough to pay you the going wage rate. So if you're interested in working, how much would you be willing to work for? And we use a classic Becker de Groot-Marchak mechanism that's incentivized. So this is an incentive compatible exercise. And the key result here is that the so 99% of individuals want to work an extra week. The vast majority, 76%, are willing to work at 0 pay. And among those who are willing to work at 0 pay, we offer an alternative. We say, okay, that's wonderful. Thank you for being willing to work at 0 pay. But we would also like to offer you the opportunity to instead answer a set of surveys, a simple set of surveys, which the organization will in fact pay you X amount for, and the X is randomized. And that way we can get at the negative potential reservation rate. And we find that among those individuals, we offer 200 taka to, again, that's near baseline savings, to answer a survey. They would rather work for free than answer that survey for 200 taka. So they're foregoing that amount, which to us is kind of compelling evidence that people are internalizing that this work is giving them some value that cannot be captured just in income. Now, I don't have time to go into confounds or mechanisms. Again, I would direct you to the paper if this is of interest to you. I will just end actually with some benchmarks, just so you can understand how large these effects are. Now, there was a psychotherapy program that was happening in the camps at the same time, in different camps, the same time as this program, which found a 0.14 standard deviation reduction in depression. It was an intensive therapy program for 1 year, compared to this, which was an employment program for 2 months, which found a 0.18 standard deviation reduction in depression. So, I don't think we've typically thought about employment programs as psychotherapy programs, but we find that it has, in fact, comparable, if not larger effects. And so I'd just like to end with that, and with a quote from Amartya Sen, who is writing not about rural South Asia, but in fact writing about high unemployment Europe in the 1980s, and identifying or suggesting the same things that we find. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Wow, that was so fascinating, and really, I think, profoundly important from a policy perspective. And I hope that the study is used in all kinds of ways in a policy context, but also replicated in different ways in different contexts, because those outcomes are so significant. Any questions? I don't see questions in the chat or the Q&A. Anybody who wants to ask a question, please do. Mariam, I see your hand up. Mariam, please come in.
Yes, Kate, I don't see where. Okay, I'm unmuted. Yes. Hello, Reshma. Mariam, I work with the EU and work closely with Kate, by the way, on the employment stimulus package. Thank you. It was really fascinating. My question was, obviously, I suppose there are different profiles in the refugees in terms of their background, education, and all that. So I was wondering if the type of work and the impact of the work is different depending on the type of work offered and the kind of persons it is offered to, if you know what I mean. Do these refugees, I mean, is the impact as big wherever the type of work is offered, or there was only one type of work? Because I think for people who are maybe more qualified, maybe they would require higher level of work, or not necessarily because they are already in such a condition that any kind of you know, at least a little bit decent work would bring that relief in terms of the you know, the psychosocial state of the person. I don't know if I make myself clear. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. Our context is a little challenging because given kind of the systemic oppression of the Rohingya in Myanmar, the range of skills that they have is maybe perhaps more compressed than other environments you might find. But we do try to look at heterogeneity by, for example, what you were doing in Myanmar. Like, were you a farmer? Were you a business person? Were you a teacher? And we don't find that the psychosocial impacts vary, at least insofar as we can capture, by your previous skills. So that might be one way to measure it. What we do find, which I hinted at, was that it does seem to be true that men benefit more, significantly more from work than cash, whereas women seem to, although they benefit significantly from work, they also seem to benefit from cash. And so that perhaps signals to why employment might be useful in these spaces. It has something to do with identity, et cetera. But I think that's a great question that, as Kate said, if we could replicate this in other settings, you would indeed want to see if the type of work mattered.
Rishman, I see one question in the Q&A which focuses on the psychosocial impact of unemployment on extremist behaviors, and suggests here that young people who engage in conflict or violent groups are often motivated by the need for recognition and a voice, and doubt being expressed as to whether access to a job will be enough, with an emphasis on the need for the work to be decent work. Any insights on this from your work?
I don't, although I don't, because we don't examine that outcome directly. I will say that the Bangladesh government expresses concerns about rising extremist behavior in these camps. Whether that's legitimate or not, I can't speak to, but I think this is an empirical question, and my sense is that so those large impacts we find, I didn't really benchmark it. Those large impacts are equivalent to a 50% increase in the likelihood of no longer being depressed, or a 20% decrease in having any suicidal thoughts. So those are quite meaningful. And if and presumably those also feed into incentives to join extremist groups, because that's the place of behavior, of voice or identity, etc. So I mean, this is all speculation, but I think it's worth exploring that outcome in these contexts.
That's great. I don't see any other hands or comments, and that actually is perfect because we ran out of time. But thank you so much. That was really insightful and fascinating. And I really urge people to read the paper as well. I still want to ask questions about the gender dimension, but we'll keep that for offline. I think let's turn now to our second presentation in this session, and to Victoria Basurto, who is joining us. She is doing her PhD and teaches in Nantes and Columbia. Since 2019, she joined Territoire Zéro Chômeur de Longue Durée. That's a program focused on the long-term unemployed in France. And her focus is on research and evaluation, but also on strategies for expanding the program into new areas. And I think this particular presentation provides a different set of insights, equally fascinating, but in a context in which unemployment benefits are assured and are generous in the French context. And the question of whether, again, people will choose to work in preference to receiving benefits without having to engage in such work. So, Victoria, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us to be part of this webinar and for sharing our project. I'm going to share my screen to this one. Okay, is this good for you? You can see it correctly? Yes, I don't know why I
Yes,
can.
that's correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's
Could you hear me? Okay.
all good.
Okay. Oh, good. So, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So our project is about employment as a right. Long-term unemployment has been an important and persistent challenge in France. Approximately 1 million people are long-term unemployed. These people have indicate that they would prefer to work if jobs were available to them. They are not, because there's not enough work experience. They don't have enough work experience or education and qualification, or maybe because they are too old or they are disabilities. So we see here that the labor market excludes them. Our project is based on this, the French Constitution, who says everyone has a duty to work and the right to get a job. And that's why we are actually doing, and we want to be sure that the access of this right for everyone, we are working on it collectively. That's why we worked also with French unions for a collective agreement adapted to the SEP. This is very important, and this right to get a job is the start point of the 3 pillars of our project. The first one is no one is unemployable if working conditions are adapted to the person. That's very important. And everyone has skills and know-how, even if there is no professional experience or something like that. There are many useful activities. This is a lack of jobs as local needs are not satisfied. And the third one is money is not an issue, considering that every year the authorities bear the cost of unemployment and shortfalls. The fundamentals of the project. The first one is what we call exhaustiveness. We find here the fundamental notion of the project is the creation of jobs necessary in the community to eliminate people's job deprivation. We do it via the structures for employment purposes or any partner of local committee for employment. This is one of the main purposes actually of this local committee. The term of exhaustiveness must be understood as a dynamic element that evolves as the experiment is implemented. The second one is no selective hiring. No selection should limit hiring. This is very important because we are going to ask people what they want to do, what they don't want to do, what do they want to learn. So it changed everything in the way of include them in the enterprises that we create. The third one is the use of the ordinary permanent contract with the choice in working hours. We see here something very important because it allows people, like single mothers that has children and they cannot go to work. They have to make a choice between going to work and has a life or just stay at home with kids. So this possibility to working in hours led us to improve our family relationship. Job training available, the job offer to people must enable them, if they so desire and if they have the means to acquire new skills. They remain available to the labor needs of the economy, and this is about giving people the opportunity to progress. The next one is employment supplementarity. The SEPs must endeavor to offer additional jobs in the territory in conjunction with the economic and social fabric. And the last one is the experimentation is local in a territory where consensus can be reached and with the actors around the table and are okay for implementing the project. A territory for us can be achieved, exhaustiveness can be achieved if we have a territory between 3,000 and 10,000, 300 and 1,000 residents. 3,000 and 10,000, I'm sorry. One of the fundamentals of the project is there is no shortage of money, and this notion often raises questions like how you're gonna do it. You have here the project economic model, which says the project consists of the activation of passive expenses. Every year in France, the government spends 43 billion to finance job deprivation. Our proposal is to make the choice to use them to produce employment. The aim is to redirect the cost of job deprivation to finance the creation of additional jobs. There was a macroecological studies made in 2017 that estimate the cost of this job was like 17,500 euros per full-time person yearly. This is within the ballpark of the 23,000 it costs to pay the salary of someone full-time at French minimum wage over the same period. In practice, only the implementation of the project according to the following method guarantees compliance with these principles. So let's see which are these steps. The project is run by two organizations. I will be short with this point, but it's very important to understand it. The first one is l'expérimentation territoriale contre le chômage de longue durée, which translate roughly as the territorial experimentation against long-term unemployment, which is a non-profit organization established in 2016 by the law that allow us to make the experimentation. This organization acts as a proxy between the government and the local projects in the territories. It is the body which the individual projects are funded, supported, and supervised. And then we have the organization that I made part of, which is Territoire sans chômeur de longue durée, several long-term unemployment territories, which is a civil society organization which runs advocacy for the program and analyze the performance of the existing projects and prepare new prospective projects. If we talk to the method, the first phase is the identification and meeting with people permanently deprived of employment. I'm sorry, no. Okay, is the development of consensus, I'm sorry. The achievement of consensus maturity is effective when the majority of stakeholders in one territory decide that they no longer wanted their community to be deprived with unemployment, and they would do everything possible to achieve it. A local committee for employment is established to administer the project and allow any volunteer who is a long-term unemployment to obtain a job. The committee consists on any and all interested stakeholders, businesses, civil society, organization, individuals, and the private persons, as well as we have the local government authorities, which is very important to work with them. The second point is meeting with people permanently deprived of employment. No selection should limit hiring, that's what we said. And we remind here over the principle to set that what they want to do, what they don't want to do, and what they want to learn. This involves relying on the usual employment operators and all the structures linked to these people's association. With the assistance of local government authorities, the Committee of Employment identifies eligible workers and approach them with the offer of a place. I mean, they're going to ask that there's a project for the right of having a work. There is a term consultation process, with prospective participants to establish what skills they are ready and what can they have with the project. The third phase is identification of useful activities. There is a consultation process with the steering committee to reach a consensus on what needs in the local community remains unmet and what productive work needs to be done to meet those needs. So when the local community decides what work the local project will undertake, the guiding principle is to create additional jobs, which is very important for us. The local committee must ensure that it means not generate employment by crowding out or undercutting existing jobs in the community. The last step is the creation of one or more structures for employment purposes. The two consultations inform the choices of the types of work the local project we support and the skills that we have for people that may part of the project. Both will lend to create the new jobs. The committee established at least one structure for employment to implement the work. And structure for employment purposes is a local nonprofit that can choose to register. A local nonprofit enterprise can choose to register as a structure of employment purposes. You can create it completely, or you can made it with another structure. These are entities under which people who are permanently unemployed are formally employed. All the future workers will be employed by the SEP, as I said before. They are entitled to all the regular workers' rights. There's no particular law for our project. And it includes also the minimum wage and any relevant benefits. This is the method dynamics, which is the phase must be animated in a flexible and agile way. You see, everything, it happens almost at the same time. The list, you have also the list of people deprived with employment that will evolve with the time. You create a job, you have more, you have more people in the SEP, And that's the way you're going to create also more opportunities for people that are waiting for a job. The ongoing experimentation, and I'm going to explain the period of this implementation. The first experimentation started to 2016 and to 2021 in 10 territories that you can see on the screen. And the second experimentation is run out from now to 2026 in extension to the first 10 territories, and at least 50 new ones. And then you can see we have at this moment 152 territories that are preparing the project. So the outcomes over the last 5 years, 1,500 people have been employed in the program across the 10 territories, of which 500 managed to subsequently find regular employment outside of the SEP, which means the important role of the local committees and the work together with all the stakeholders. This leads to 1,000 formerly people are permanently deprived of employment, currently employed in the SEP. The job characteristics, so what do we do? The volunteer team in the project are 43% that contribute in some way towards France's ecological transition, which means farm work, circular economy, recycling shop, activities against food waste, and things like that. The second part is 34% of local development, which means services provisions for local businesses, organizations, tourism, and local production. And 29% about social cohesion, which means building shared values and communities of interpretation, reducing disparities and exclusion, services for people living in the area, like queuing, delivery, transport bike, repair, solidarity, mobility, what we call assisting people who cannot afford or live too far from the nearest cities to access medical services, buy food, etc. We can find also the management of charity food shops, workshop for people under the poverty level, local selling trucks. It helps isolated people to access to food, to talk to another one, to create this social link that is very important. The human centered.
Just a few more minutes.
Yes. I just have 2 slides. So, the human-centered approach, it means have a job, help people to get back to the public sphere, a place common to all of us. Get back to the school to pick up their children. They are perceived otherwise by society and by their families. They have a job that makes sense because it responds to societal and global challenges like ecological transition, local development, social cohesion. Another thing which is important, and it's one of the results that we can see of these first 10 territories, is that the no hiring allows more than 21% of workers that are people with disabilities. It could be more important, it depends the SPE, but because there are some ones that are also like 43% of workers are in situation of disability. The permanent contract means for the families to have vacations, better place to live, better material living conditions, and higher income, better health, because more of the people didn't went to the doctor because they didn't have enough money to afford it. So it means that the results are very important for us. And just for finishing, the profiles we have for this first experience, we can see that we have more than 50% of people that has 42 years or more, and almost 21% of those people that have 52 years or more, which means if they cannot find a job, this must be something because they are older for the labor market, and so they cannot find a solution. And the third point is no qualification, which means that they will never find a job out of the project. And that was something that was pointed by the government as one of the main results that we have. And I think I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, what is fascinating about this is that, you know, I really think, particularly in the developed world, where unemployment benefits are a norm, that it opens huge options for flexibility. I'm going to start with a question and invite people to put up your hands and share in the chat. In fact, let me go straight to Jean Mageres. Would you like to come in with a question? Jean, I think you need to unmute.
You can write the questions, otherwise.
True. But I think he's unmuted now. No, something's not working. So while we sort that out, a question that I have is the extent of take-up. So in the territories where the program is running, what percentage of the long-term unemployed respond to the opportunity and choose to participate in the program? Over to you.
Okay. During these 5 years, we can meet almost more than 2,000 people in those 10 territories to propose them the project. I think I forgot to say that this voluntary project, which means if people don't want to, they don't have to. So over those 2,300 people that we meet, we have only 1,000 in the SEPs. So the question is, and that's a question that we ask ourselves, and that's why we want to implement a research and evaluation process for this second phase, is why they don't come to the project. And that's a real question, because it's not a job, it's just we are giving you the opportunity to access to a right and to participate all the transformation of the society and everything, and they don't come. So that's, we have to answer now, why don't do it?
So that's about,
I don't have an answer for these questions.
So it's just under 50% take up, which is fascinating. Jean, shall we try you again? Would you like to come in? If you can unmute. No, for some reason that's not working. I'm not seeing questions in the chat or the Q&A. Something that I found fascinating in the program is the local consultation with local communities and stakeholders to identify useful work that can be undertaken. What kind of a response, how responsive do you find local structures to the opportunity to identify work and to host these kinds of programs?
I think this is one of the main pillars of the project in the territories. I mean, because there is not an administrative structure that it's already created. It's just by, you want to work with me, it's good. Do you want to do it too? Okay, it's perfect. So let's do it together. And that's the way we are going to create a local committee for employment. And which is very interesting is that it's France, it's a very centralized country, you know, politics are. And these local committees are just asking if maybe it could be better and more performant if at a local level we can ask us the question about how implement the employment, how find a response to the needs of my territory, and how can I make a kind of governance about this this local need. And what we found is that in some territories there is not only the thing about employment, they are also thinking about other needs. I mean, like if we are going to think about the family's needs, or they're talking about the how to access to a house for those people. I mean, it's all about employment, which is not only create one job, is this person that has to work, that needs to work and wants to work, has already many needs that has to be, and I'm sorry, because my English is very limited, it has to be treated. I mean, Kate, you're in mute.
Stupid of me. Michael, is that your hand I see?
Yes, that is. Thanks, Kate. I have a question around if Victoria can say something about one on where the regions, so urban kind of contexts or small towns where it is where you see different interests, and then also maybe more about the profile of the people who were, if there's something to be said about that, whether it's, I saw you have a relatively older group in terms of age, but is there something to say, for instance, around migrants or not, around, you know, young people. So maybe something a bit more about the group, what you've seen in that sense.
Yeah. Between the 10 first territories, we have 5 urban ones and 5 in rural ones. There was not thinking that way, but that was the results. You know, there's not the project that chooses the territories. Is the labor minister that will choose the ones that are going to experiment it. So what we find is when you have when you're in a urban territory, you have more young people to go in. The urban territories we have there, you know, is the territories between 3,000 and 10,000 persons, which is a small territory for experimented. And in the cities, you can find it in the I forgot my words, the quartier, which means that you have a population that are younger than in another territory. We have, for the first experimentation, more than 55% of women, and that talks to this open of the labor market to women and age women. So, which is like they cannot do it otherwise. So your question was the territories, the profiles. We don't have migrant people. We have people from another countries, but they already have papers in France and they are already established in the country. You know, I think there will be a subject to see what's going on in these territories, and they are present in the urban territories, so more than in urban ones. I think that's
great. Victoria, thank you very much. I think this is a fascinating policy, and I hope that some of the other countries with similar social protection systems for the unemployed might learn from and explore from this experience as well.
Belgium are doing it.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Great. So thank you, and Michael, back to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate, Reshma, and Victoria. Really fascinating session, exploring really a number of questions that are so relevant and of which there's often very little said or often very little known. So we are now supposed to go to the next session, which will be chaired by Samuel Asfaha, and in which we would have Paul Niehaus, who will be presenting. But we have not, he has not shown up yet, Paul. At least I don't see him on the participant section. He is based in California, so it's very early for him. And I am a bit worried he may have overslept. I see Sam is here. Sam, I don't know if you have had any news from Paul at this point.
No, not yet. I haven't heard from him. Okay,
so yeah, so let's. I did send him an email just now. I have not. He has not responded. So I think one solution may be that we maybe swap around sessions, unless Paul comes back to us in the next minute. I see Christina and Kate and Lucas are all here. So I want to ask them if that would be okay with them, if they are prepared to that we swap the order, and then we'll chase Paul to see if his alarm clock didn't go off or if there's another problem on his side. Yeah, Sam, is that, can we do that?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, no problem for me. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam.
All right, cheers.
All right. So with that, then maybe let me hand over to Christina, who will then chair what used to be the last session, but is not the last one, which will focus really on the social contract and moving forward. So without much, I'm going to hand over to Christina Beren from our Social Protection Department in ILO. Christina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael, and I hope you all bear with me with this kind of rather spontaneous coming in. But I hope I saw Kate nodding, and I hope for Lucas it's fine. It's fine as well. Okay, no, that's great. Now, and it's really an enormous pleasure to be with you for this session and to chair this session on public employment programs and the social contract of the future with two very exciting presentations, one from Lucas Lehner and the other one from Kate Phillips. So I think this is really very, it's great. And I think, I mean, unfortunately I've missed some of the previous session, but the bits that I heard were very much already pointing to the important questions around the social contract, about the value of work, about the relationship between work and income, and obviously also the relationship between, I mean, how can we really think about policies that are able to really make sure that people have access to both work and income and social protection. So really to square that important circle. And I think with that, I would like to go straight to the first presentation. And let me just quickly find Lucas' bio. So Lucas is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, Department of Social Policy, and at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. And he's been doing a lot of research on labor market policies, slow wage growth, and very recently also, I think he's also known to many of you as the founder of the Oxford Super Tracker on the COVID policy trackers and surveys. So I think that's really very much a pleasure to have you here, and also to hear more about your work on the Marienthal study. And I think everyone who's had kind of some exposure to kind of sociology and labor market studies probably knows this very seminal study of Marienthal. So I think it's great to have you kind of go back and revisit the questions and have this important work about the guaranteed jobs program in that context. And so I think for that, I'll hand over to you, Lucas. So you have 20 minutes, and we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Christina. I hope you can see my screen, my slides. And yeah, thank you so much, Christina, for the kind introduction. Many thanks to Michael and colleagues for the invitation. It's a particular pleasure for me to return today, essentially 5 years after I've worked for the ILO, which also inspired me to carry on the decent work agenda in me and carry out my research on labor market policies, which essentially resulted in this project, where we are evaluating a small pilot for a job guarantee project that we were able to set up in an experimental design ex ante, and therefore we hope to get some particularly interesting results that could inspire the wide debate on job guarantee programs. And actually, I think the timing also works well now, because I think our pilot ties in very nicely with the two previous presentations. On the one hand, we have a smaller scale but more experimental setup compared to the French territoria of zero unemployment zones. And it also ties in neatly with Reshman's presentation, because we also build on Marie Jahoder's work on the non-income benefits of employment that Christina also mentioned. And I will go more on this topic now in the presentation. So unemployment, as we all know, is a core social and labor market problem, and there are different proposals discussed, but there is no solutions, right? It's a very heated political topic in the debates. That's also what led us to this experimental setup in this pilot, in order to have a clear and clean evaluation of a public employment program. Because many of these programs, including in Austria, where we are piloting it, have been similar programs have been implemented in the past, but always with accompanied by heated political debates. And so the attempt here is to start with an experimental design, to randomize the treatment and control groups, and therefore have an evaluation that we have ex ante specified, and kind of have a more evidence-based discussion on it. And it is a discussion on a very heated political topic of job guarantee proposals that have received a lot of attention, especially in recent years. But these proposals are, on the one hand, innovative, but also build on a long tradition of public work programs. And yesterday's presentations on the history of the ILO and the history of public employment programs that the ILO was a driver of has been very interesting by Anna McLeod, and I really enjoyed that historical overview. Just to pick out, for instance, in the United States, under the New Deal, public employment programs were implemented massively. And in India, which Paul Niehaus is going to present, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is today the by far largest employment guarantee program worldwide. Now, there are also debates how such employment programs could work in high-income countries, and the largest project of such is certainly in France that Victoria presented. The territories against for zero long-term unemployment, which it is really great to see how they have been expanding over the recent years. But there are also smaller projects in other countries that relate to it. For instance, in Berlin, the solidaristic basic income, that is some kind of participatory income where recipients are need to participate in society. Now, what do we expect of the job guarantee program? On the one hand, a job guarantee program can be an unconditional outside option to those who are typically the worst off in their bargaining positions. Obviously, in employment, so bargaining between employees and especially the unemployed job seekers towards employers, but not only limited to the labor relations, also in respect of unemployed to state bureaucracies and administrations, and even possibly in the private sphere of romantic relationships, where we know that many, especially women, are often pressured and forced to stay with their partners because of economic reasons. So a job guarantee may provide an outside option to enhance the discretion and the decision-making power of those individuals who are worst off in our societies. Second, the job guarantee has also the potential to cover previously uncovered populations, so to extend coverage of social safety nets, dropping conditionalities and means testing, and diminishing the problems of benefit non-take-up. And third, job guarantee programs have also the potential to act as an automatic stabilizer. There has been a lot of work on smoothing the business cycle by job guarantee programs from a macro perspective, but also on the individual level. Job guarantee programs can act as a stabilizer for individual consumption for those who receive work under a job guarantee program by stabilizing disposable income. Now, there are a lot of additional non-wage benefits that employment brings in our society, and Reshman has really given a great overview on these non-wage benefits and how they were able to filter them out in their study with the research design. We are also building on the knowledge of Marie Jahoda, Paul Lazarsfeld, and Hans Zeisel, who in the 1930s, as Christina mentioned, conducted their seminal study of unemployment in Marienthal, which in the 1930s was a typical industrial town that was hit severely by the Great Depression with mass unemployment. And Maria Jahoda, Paul Lazarsfeld, and the team went out to do some field work to examine how the community was affected by unemployment, to follow up on the expectation that unemployment would free up time resources and potentially lead to more time being available for unemployed to pursue all the activities they wanted to. But actually, and surprisingly, not surprisingly today, they found quite the opposite, that the entire community life eroded. People were not able to spend the spare time that they had in a meaningful way, even though they had more of the spare time available. They stopped pursuing their hobbies, community life eroded, even political activities stopped quite. So derived on that, there is a long literature on the functions of employment, and these are also the latent, called the latent benefits of employment besides the income. And these are collective purpose, work as a source of meaning, social inclusion, because there is social interaction at work. It also relates a lot to social status, the respect that people gain instead of social stigma in their work. But also the activity that people gain and the energy and involvement in life, and certainly the time structure that is affected by work. So because typically in our societies, work is the time in the day is divided in spare time and working time, and that is really affected by the working day. And lastly, of course, the income as an economic basis. Now, what is happening in the Marienthal job guarantee pilot? It's a small-scale pilot that was very carefully designed in last year in this town of Grammat-Neusiedl, Marienthal, by the Public Employment Service. So designed in a way that it could be transferred to other towns in other countries, in other contexts, to be piloted again. And there essentially, the Public Employment Service is essentially tasking a service provider to found a social enterprise that provides training and offers jobs to everyone who has been unemployed for longer than 12 months. And includes preparatory training for up to 8 weeks that is very individually targeted. And I'm gonna tell you more about it now. But first, what are the key characteristics? First, and that was also crucial for our involvement in the evaluation, the job offer is entirely voluntary. Unemployed are free to decide whether they would like to take up the job offer or whether they would like to refuse and continue to receive their benefits and support by the Public Employment Service. Second, work is paid by the collectively bargained wage. So participants receive a proper employment contract with social insurance and social protection, and receive the wage as other employees will receive as well. It is not a workfare scheme where unemployed would be obliged to carry out some tasks to receive the benefits. Third, a lot of emphasis is being placed on meaningful employment, taking into account personal constraints of individuals, but also emphasizing that there is meaningful work being carried out, meaningful for the participants, but also meaningful for the wider community. And I'm just worried that you cannot see my screen, so just let me double check. Can you see my slide completely?
We see the slides, but it's not in kind of full page mode. So if you can increase the size a bit, that would be even better.
Right. I hope you can see them now again in the full slide mode.
Yes. Yeah. Perfect.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. Okay. So what is happening in the training phase that is very particularly designed by the Public Employment Service? So the training phase focuses on health, on developing resources, on discussing the future and career planning with unemployed. And lastly, once the training phase is completed in employment, the support continues with job-specific support, job search and application support, but also all the previous pillars are maintained depending on the individual needs. So individuals, when they start with the program, they first get a comprehensive health check and health training. They also get transferable skills training on soft skills, on job applications, on IT skills, but also job-specific skills depending on their needs. And of course, some people receive a lot of more training than others. So it's very individually targeted. Second, or third, there are individual and group-based workshops and consultations on career planning, on what kind of projects unemployed are motivated and find useful to carry out. So the idea is that projects carried out by the job guarantee program would not be centrally planned by someone like us as researchers or by the public administration, but much more that the project creation would be based on community needs and on the local knowledge from the communities. And lastly, during the job guarantee participation, the employed get continued support to find jobs outside the job guarantee. However, they are not pressured to do so. They're also fine to remain in the job guarantee and carry out the employment instead of being unemployed and carry out meaningful tasks. Now, how does this work out in practice? In practice, we see that the jobs created are to a certain share in the newly founded social enterprise, and they include tasks such as carpentry and renovation activities, public gardening in the community, support for elderly, but there are also some of these projects created by the participants themselves, and that's what I mentioned before, by trying to source knowledge of the local community. And this includes, for instance, planning of a bike trail that connects different towns, a book project, or a topothek, which is a kind of a digital library. And in addition to that, there is a private sector arm that subsidizes jobs in the regular labor market of long-term unemployed, where a certain share of their wage is being paid to private employers to employ the long-term unemployed, but that is, again, as I said, voluntary for the unemployed, whether they take up such a job or whether they don't. Now, this received a lot of public attention, which is on the one hand nice for the idea, but it's also a challenge, of course, for the evaluation. Now, our study design, and I will just be very brief on this, I can answer any questions later if there are, is based on the dual strategy, on a pairwise matching, which is the experimental design, and the staggered rollout, which divides the long-term unemployed in the municipality into a treatment group that received the job offer first and the control group that received the job offer and invitation to the program only 4 months later. And so that is helpful for us to get short-time effects of the job guarantee program. We continue to evaluate the longer-term effects with control groups from other municipalities. But of course, that's not exactly an experimental design later on. Second, we also compare municipality level effects to get a sense of possible spillover and equilibrium effects on the wider labor market, on non-affected non-eligible groups such as short-term unemployed or employed. We are now in the process of evaluating this data, and I'm going to present some very first results. We are not receiving any payments for any of these evaluations, and we'll publish our findings independently from the implementation partners. Now, the participants themselves are a quite precarious group, and I just want to point out how precarious long-term unemployed are in several aspects. First, everyone who has been unemployed for longer than a year, half of them have been unemployed for even 5 years in the past 10 years. A third of all long-term unemployed have some kind of medical condition that restrains them from carrying out specific tasks of work. Around half have no more than the minimal education. And also half are over 50 years of age, and we know that this group has it particularly hard to find jobs. Now, you see here that the red dot is Grammat-Neusiedl, Marienthal, where the intervention takes place, and it's about 45 minutes travel from Vienna. And you see that the other control towns are spread out over, which are the towns that have the most similar we picked those control towns that have the most similar profiles to ground noise in the labor market and population characteristics. Now, we constructed a synthetic control that matches the labor market development of Marienthal to evaluate the effects later on. And just to give you a glimpse on the preliminary findings before I sum up, the pilot is continuing to be in progress until 2024, and we conducted an in-depth survey with all participants, and the first wave started to work last year. The second started to work early this year, and in between we conducted the survey, which was a very comprehensive investigation. We also have in parallel a team of sociologists from the University of Vienna who are investigating more qualitatively the mechanisms that are at play. And we hope to gain some complementary insights through that approach. What we have done is to construct some indices from the survey, from our survey batteries that we asked, and I'm now going to show you the results of these indices on several dimensions. But to sum up, the job guarantee has led to higher incomes of formerly unemployed who now receive the job. Well, that alone may not be too surprising by itself, but it has also improved health, physical health, as well as mental health. And overall well-being. And that led to improvements in social inclusion, in collective purpose of individuals, and of time structure, as could be expected by the theory of latent benefits of employment that I outlined before. However, preferences were fairly stable in our research, and that's actually a finding that I found striking in Reshman's presentation. So that seems to be different in our case, that preferences regarding to time preferences, also risk preferences, remain stable and were not affected by receiving employment. We think that this is fairly consistent with the literature that points to stability of preferences over time that cannot so easily be changed. We are very curious if they will change over the longer term of the program. Now, this is just a brief glimpse where you see the differences in the effects that I just summarized, and I can go back more in detail on these individual results if there are questions in the Q&A. So essentially, to sum up, the preliminary findings of the job guarantee pilot, they point to social improvements in several areas, particularly for incomes, for mental health, for well-being, and for social inclusion. However, what is an issue in our pilot is external validity remains an issue because of the very small pilot. So there is a remaining need to repeat such experiments in different contexts. And I'm actually very glad to see today in some of the other presentations, evaluations that also investigate job guarantee programs, because I think these research projects can really be complementary to them. And also our pilot, I think, is fairly transferable to other places and contexts, especially in high-income countries in our case. So as next steps, we will be separating out possible anticipation effects and investigate longer-term outcomes on the municipal level to see whether there are spillover effects that affect non-eligible shorter time unemployed or employed. Now, lastly, I want to thank you for the invitation and attention and conclude by a quote that goes back to the initial Marienthal study that also concludes by saying, "We've entered the soil of Marienthal as researchers. We've left it with the one wish that the tragic opportunity of such experimentation may soon be gone from our time." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for this very, very stimulating presentation. And I think that was very, very interesting. And I already saw that there's already 2 questions in the chat. But I think please hold on with your questions, because I think we'll first listen to Kate and then have a discussion at the end. But I would really like to encourage everyone to put down your questions in the Q&A so that we can come back to that after the 2 presentations. And I would also like to thank you particularly also for sticking to the time really perfectly. That was exactly 20 minutes. So that's great. So let's see whether Kate, whether you can match that. I think Lucas has put the bar very high. And so Kate, sorry, no, I have to go to your point. I think, Kate, you don't need any introduction. And also you've been talking before. But I think Kate is known for a very, very long career and her very rich work on employment policies in various contexts and aspects. And currently she's the program lead of the Presidential Employment Stimulus, supported by the Project Management Office in the presidency of the President of South Africa, and with a long list of other things that I'm not even starting to summarize. So now it's really a pleasure to have you, and I really do like the title of your presentation, which is "Employment Matters Too Much to Society to Leave It to Markets Alone: The Role of Public Employment Programs as Part of a Social Contract for the Future of Work." So please, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christina. Let me just share the presentation. Hang on, I'm trying to get it onto slideshow. Yeah. Okay, I'm assuming it's up. Christina, is it?
It is. Okay. It is. Yes.
Great. So yes, that is the title, which creates the difficulty of covering quite a lot of issues. But in fact, many of these issues have been touched on in the course of the webinar, and I found it so fascinating how many of the themes that I will cover have in fact formed part of the inputs both yesterday and today. So let's start with society, work, and the social contract. And I think the critical issue here is that work is so intrinsic to what we are as society. So these questions, who contributes what to their household, to their community, to their society? On what terms do they contribute it? And in return for what rights and protections? These questions are actually completely central to how societies organize. And work is critical in that context because work is seen as the mechanism through which a contribution is made to the support of the household, to the community, to the society, whether it's paid or unpaid work. People are seen to qualify for social benefits as reciprocity for the contribution that they make when they are able to make one. And a lot of this is implicit, a lot of this is not stated. I found it so interesting in Victoria's presentation, the quote from the French Constitution, which summed it up perfectly, that people have a duty to work and a right to work. So this issue of work is very fundamental to the social contract. When we talk about the social contract, the focus tends to be on issues of reciprocity, of solidarity, of rights and social protection. The reality is that there's a dark side to it as well, because social censure is reserved for those who are deemed to be non-contributors, to be dependent on discourse, who are deemed to be not self-supporting and therefore a burden on society. And it is this dimension that creates a lot of the stigma that contributes to the negative psychosocial impacts that we've been hearing about. This quote from George Osborne, who was then Chancellor of the UK, really captures it very powerfully. Where is the fairness, we ask, for the shift worker leaving home in the dark hours of the early morning, who looks up at the closed blinds of their next door neighbor, sleeping off a life of benefits? This really captures this dynamic of this implicit social contract, the duty to work, duty to contribute, because if one side of the social contract is an expectation of a social contribution through work, then surely the other side has to be a societal responsibility to provide the opportunity to work. So work matters, and we've heard it throughout these 2 days, and it is about more than just the income, the inclusion, the belonging, the social recognition. It's a critical marker of transitions to adulthood and is very much part of the social construction of masculinity in many societies, which was why I was not surprised to find the gender outcomes that Reshman highlighted earlier. And the impacts of participating in work provide the counterfactual to this. Again, capabilities, networks, life skills, self-discipline, learning teamwork, mutual accountability, creativity, learning collective organization, management skills. And while participation in work matters to the individuals affected, what we also often underestimate is that all of these capabilities matter to the wider functioning of society as a whole, and they're also fundamental to productivity in the wider economy. This is why so many global social contracts have a commitment to full employment. It's a recognition of that the contribution of work is fundamental. Particularly in contexts in many parts of the world where people do not have access to land for subsistence, survival, or other means of production, people are dependent on selling their labor. Yet the right to work in practice has become a right to work when there is market demand for labor. And the reality is that certainly in the last 20 years, full employment has been honored mainly in the breach. So what are the instruments the state can use to ensure full employment? And the reality is that it is a full toolbox. And plan A is that all of these tools are used to enable market-based employment outcomes. That is plan A, that your macro policy, industrial policy, development finance, public investment, labor market policy, all of these things ensure that there is work for those that need it in society. But because of all the reasons we've heard, societies need a plan B for when the market response actually falls short. And this is where public employment comes in, forms of direct employment funded by the state through public employment programs, employment guarantees, the state as employer of last resort. There is a wide spectrum of these forms of public interventions to create employment. But it's important to recognize that plan B is not just relief. It's a stimulus in its own right. It actually supports plan A because the incomes that are earned are spent in local economies. In our context, they support the informal sector and small enterprises, and they trickle up into wider value chains from there, supporting jobs across the economy. They have multipliers in wider markets, which is what we were going to hear from Paul, and I hope we still do. They build work capabilities crucial to productivity, to maintaining the link to the labor market. Work experience is often a gateway into the labor market, and is also often a critical factor enabling livelihood and entrepreneurial activity. So we need to move away from a binary analysis that looks either at market-based employment or at public employment, and understand that actually, yes, market-based employment is plan A, but when it's insufficient, we need a plan B, and the plan B actually supports plan A as well. These are integrated approaches. So this discussion was part of the discussion, very much part of the debate, and then COVID came and shocked our world. I think the importance of this is that it has reminded us of what binds societies together: solidarity, reciprocity, and care, and that these things need to be institutionalized, not based on random acts of kindness. And so, this period has given us a moment to reimagine how the pieces might fit together, and what the role of the state could be, should be, in protecting society as a whole. Yes, it's become a slogan, but yes, to build back better. And so what implications does this have for the future of work? And what implications does it have for the role of public employment in that context in particular? Now, many of you will remember that before COVID hit, there was a lot of focus on the future of work. There were reports from the ILO, from the World Bank. It was very much a theme in 2019. This particular slide I delivered in a presentation in Bergamo in the first week of December in 2019, not knowing that COVID was already there. And it is fascinating, how many of the things that were part of the discussion have been, in a sense, fast-tracked and elevated and augmented in the context of the pandemic. The quote here is, "The future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed," making reference to the inequality of outcomes that are anticipated from some of the developments that form part of what we imagine the future of work to be. So all of these things were part of the debate, are part of the debate, issues of precarity, informality, innovation, the robots, and the issue of better jobs or worse jobs, and the gig economy, underemployment, aging populations, youth bulges. These dimensions differ in different contexts all over the world, and so the issues of concern for the future of work differ too. The question, the debate has been, will there be less jobs? Will there be more jobs? Will there be better jobs? Will there be worse jobs? The fact of the matter is that none of these outcomes is inexorable. Social processes will determine them, and the social contract is a critical component of this. And when we look at the future of work, what becomes very clear very quickly is that while the productivity enhancements from technological change certainly have their potential risks and effects, it's not all about the robots. Along came the pandemic, with huge implications on the world of work. Climate change, the impacts have really, in a sense, become so much more evident in this period as well. The green lining, as opposed to the silver lining, is the opportunity for green jobs as part of the future of work. Conflict and displacement continue to impact on labor markets in all kinds of unanticipated ways. And demographic shifts have huge implications also. The bottom line is that uncertainty for the future of work is certain, but we can pretty much rely on high levels of job displacement, job churn, and social disruption. Markets can be disrupted in unanticipated ways also. And once again, what we see is the crucial role of the state in managing all of this and limiting the negative impacts on people. So what role can public employment programs play in this context? The argument here is that our major challenge is to build societies that work. And that is intended in the full meaning of the phrase. So yes, societies in which people work, but also societies that work for people. And that in fact, there really is the opportunity to bring these two together. And that quote from Keynes that was used for the seminar, there's work to be done, there are people to do it, why not put these together? This is a critical part of the challenge. And part of that is recognizing and institutionalizing the recognition that labor can create social, environmental, and indeed economic value, even when it has no market value in a given context. We have come to measure the value of labor in relation to its market value. What we need are instruments that can unlock those other dimensions of value so that that value can be fed into society as a whole. And public employment programs are actually a critical instrument in doing this, in unlocking that value. That unused labor is a huge societal resource, and what we need are instruments able to deploy labor in ways that optimize the social, environmental, and economic impacts of the work undertaken. So the work matters. Yes, in the history of PEPs, sometimes there have been make-work programs of low social value. There's no time for that. There's too much work to be done to make the world a better place. So we need to institutionalize alternatives to the economic forces that are driving things like precarity, working poverty, unpaid work, underemployment, and unemployment. And one of the most powerful ways we can do that is by giving people choices. And by giving people choices, we don't remove the role of markets, but we temper the primacy of markets in determining social and environmental outcomes. And within this context, there's the opportunity for whole of society approaches that work with communities that create new forms of partnership, making publicly funded employment a resource for community-driven development as part of building or rebuilding the commons. So this is the challenge that PEPs, this is the challenge we face. And the argument here is that public employment programs actually are a powerful development instrument that we have not been using optimally. Markets are social constructs. I can refer you to Haiyun Chang and Douglas North for the theory and the background to this phrase. But the critical point here is that, yes, indeed, markets are social constructs. We determine, societies determine the rules of the game. And the outcomes from markets at present are not always optimal. Our challenge is to construct them differently. How do we use public employment programs to do so? To limit the role of desperation, to limit the commoditization of labor, and to provide socially mandated alternatives when market demand for labor is low that recognize its other forms of value. And I'm going to go through some of the ways in which I think public employment programs very practically can do so. So the first relates to the role of public employment programs in providing new ways of creating a labor market floor. Now, we've tried to do this through many different mechanisms, through regulation, but in fact, by providing an alternative at decent conditions is one of the most powerful ways in which public employment programs can influence market outcomes. So in India, in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which Paul, I hope, will still be talking to us about, by paying minimum wages, the program led to increases in agricultural wages, where those wages were in fact deemed to be working poverty. And by paying equal wages, the program has contributed to closing the gender wage gap. So by providing an alternative at decent conditions, workers are empowered to reject and resist conditions that would erode their rights and erode conditions at work. So it's a powerful instrument in creating a labor market floor. But what does that mean in the context of what we imagine as the future of work, in the context of precarity, the gig economy, informality, that is a key issue in many economies? All of these dimensions of what is the current and anticipated part of the future of work are characterized by insecure episodes of work, which mean underemployment, precariousness being part of the working poor. Could we use forms of public employment to close some of this gap? If people could rely on regular and predictable participation in part-time work through public employment programs, can this provide a form of floor, enhancing their bargaining power in relation to gig work and precarious work, enhancing their choices, and enhancing their incomes? How can we use public employment programs to provide pathways out of informality and unpaid work also? We heard yesterday from my colleague Lerato Shai how this has happened in South Africa, where often unpaid care work was provided with a form of formalization through payment through public employment programs. And in a context in which we anticipate a lot of disruption in labor markets, how can public employment programs be used to fill employment gaps, to smooth transitions, to keep people in the labor market between opportunities? On the climate front, the approaching climate tsunami, we see that all over the world there's a need for massive investment in environmental works, and public employment programs are able to provide a vehicle for this at every level in communities. I'm surprised that public employment programs have not been used more in the context of integration of refugees and displaced people, despite the fact that there are such programs. But the reality is that many of the psychosocial impacts of being refugees are not dissimilar from the impacts of unemployment. And through the provision of public employment programs, there's a potential powerful instrument for the integration of refugees into new communities and an opportunity to be seen to be contributing to their new society through the work undertaken. As part of the future of work, part of the debate was concern that digitization was leading to what was called an epidemic of loneliness. Concern that the digital world will reduce social interaction and that important component of participation in work, which is the social interaction, the networks, and so on. The reality is that we need new social instruments and institutions to build civic capital, social ties, networks, and social cooperation. We saw in the French program that community participation in the identification of work can provide an opportunity for engagement that involves not only the participants, but the local community as well, providing a platform for community engagement. The pandemic has really highlighted the importance of public space and the need for work to be done to transform public spaces and to create new uses for public space. Even in the developed world, this can be hard to sustain on a volunteer basis, but it's a vital and growing form of citizen engagement. Building their commons needs instruments of support. The argument here is that public employment programs can provide such instruments. Now, we heard from Anna on the first day that historically infrastructure has been a big part of the history of public employment. And of course, infrastructure still matters for development. And deficits in core infrastructure are a critical issue in many developing contexts. But where employment creation is the primary aim, then the reality is that a far more diverse menu of work has started to emerge with service-oriented forms of employment that have much higher labor intensities and where a much higher proportion of a given budget is able to go to the costs of labor. I won't go through this whole line. This is just an example of the kinds of ideas that come from communities when consulted about work that can serve the common good. From support to education, community libraries, literacy classes, computer clinics, to food security, urban agriculture, food waste strategies, more digital forms of work, recording social history, design of public interest apps and websites, public art, counseling for victims of violence, community radio, cleanups and recycling, river rehabilitation. There literally is no shortage of work to be done to improve the quality of life in most communities in the world. And it's not just unskilled manual labor, which has been something of a tradition in the public employment space. We saw this in Greece, where many of the people who were unemployed were highly skilled. And the program there used psychologists to counsel people in distressed communities. Archaeologists, historians, and computer scientists created interactive history programs. Physiotherapists provided services to the elderly and poor communities. Vets sterilized stray animals in the cities. There were many other examples of the use of skilled people in the context of public employment, also enhancing the social impact of the work undertaken. So public employment can also support diverse social policy goals. I couldn't resist putting this slide in because this is the program we are running. It's just entered its second phase as part of the employment stimulus. 320,000 young people were placed in 22,000 schools as school assistants, providing enormous support in the context of the COVID stresses with really strong social outcomes and high labor intensity because the vast majority of the costs were to wages. A program like this also has amazing levels of spatial equity because there are schools in every community, and we took full advantage of that. Finally, social employment. This is a term that we've coined in South Africa, but it reflects an existing reality, which is that a huge amount of work for the common good is already undertaken by organizations in communities across the country. How do we use public employment to strengthen those community-based organizations, creating a tool and an instrument that can enhance local initiative and unlock local agency? The process that can support social economy. The whole point of the social economy is that it is driven by social rather than market objectives, and often support through an instrument like public employment can provide that extra element of social support that can tip such enterprises, that can tip the balance of sustainability. We saw earlier today how public employment can complement social protection measures with new ways of new interfaces between social protection and public employment. And there's a need to look at the interface between income security and the opportunity to work. We heard quite powerfully today that it is about more than just the income. So finally, and this is my last slide, the challenge we face is, and the opportunity is, to reimagine the roles that public employment programs can play. From everything that we've heard during this webinar, what we can see is that this is a really powerful development instrument that we have only just begun to see the kinds of impacts that it can have across a spectrum of development challenges. So it's a tool to end or limit involuntary unemployment and underemployment. We need to see this not just as a crisis response, but as an institutionalized countercyclical part of the labor market. We need to use public employment programs to set a labor standards floor, and to do so in new ways in the context of the changing world of work. We need integrated approaches that synergize with minimum incomes and other social protection policies. There's certainly not a binary choice between these different instruments. We also need to see that there are new ways of using these programs for public value creation through new forms of work that can advance pretty much all of the SDGs with appropriate design. And finally, we can use public employment programs to strengthen the commons and create new forms of social engagement and participation in community-driven ways that unlock agency at the local level, not just for participants, but for wider forms of social and community engagement also. The bottom line is, as the title said, employment matters too much to leave to markets alone. Public employment programs give us a really powerful instrument with which to create alternatives. Thanks, and back to you, Christina.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this extremely comprehensive and stimulating presentation. I think there's so much food for thought, and we have only 5 minutes left. So let me just jump into the questions. There are 3 questions that have been mentioned. I think some of them are directed to Lucas, but I think you also have a lot to say on it, Kate. The first one is a question from Mariam, and I understand that she had already to leave, but I think the question is very, very important. What entails meaningful employment, and how is that defined, and to what extent, I mean, who actually judges about what is meaningful? I mean, is it actually the participant, or is it the administration, or whose decision is it actually? And I think this points us also very importantly to the question that we see in the context of a lot of activation policies. I mean, what's the where to find the balance between providing kind of the invitation to work, because I mean sometimes it's also very much linked to coercion in one or the other way. And I think looking at this issue of what is meaningful and who decides what's meaningful is important. Then we have a question from Anna, and I see that there's more questions coming in. So, but let me just kind of quickly read out the questions, and then I'll give you some time to respond to them. So I think the question from Anna is specifically to Lucas' presentation about the job guarantee pilot, whether it's already rolled out to municipalities, and whether the training given, the training to which category? So it's more kind of skilled unemployed or unskilled unemployed community members, or both. Then Miriam, I think this is more a comment, agrees with Kate about the need to look at integrated PEP programs with regard to integrated planning and implementation. And Jay asks whether there's any indication or whether or not participation is associated with a longer absence from market employment. And she or he refers to the PEP program in the UK and Ireland over the last 30 years with regard to effects regarding unemployment. And then there was a question from Nito in the chat, question to Lucas, to the question, and I think that's an important one, whether the Austrian program is extended to refugees and migrants. And I'm just trying to check whether there's anything more. No, I don't think. I think that is quite a long list of questions. And if I may add another one for Kate, because I think you mentioned one important point with regard to a labor floor. And I think this is very interesting also to see the complementarity between a social protection floor and a labor protection floor. It would be great to have a bit more of your thoughts on that. And so I think I would first hand over to Lucas, and maybe if you can, given that we need to hand back to Michael and to Samuel for the last session, if you could limit your response to 2 minutes, and then Kate, you're going to have the last word. So over to you, Lucas.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you all for the questions. I briefly tried to run through, although that will be a challenge. Very good questions. So first, Mariam, on what is meaningful employment. So we define meaningful employment as both meaningful to individuals as well as to the community as a whole. And that entails taking care of individual needs, such as providing jobs that are different for blue collar or white collar previous job experiences, but also that are taking care of individual needs and constraints. So for instance, most long-term unemployed who start working under the job guarantee do not work full-time. So they have the choice how to what extent do they want to work, and most engage in work of 20 to 30 hours a week. And we see now as the program continues that some continue gradually to increase their working time. So that points us that perhaps it may be a way into employment, to transition into employment step by step after a long absence of formal employment. Also, it's entirely voluntary. As Christina emphasized, that's a very important aspect. So there is only a fine line between a job guarantee, public employment guarantee, and workfare or forced labor. So I think that's a very important aspect. And what is very interesting is that former unemployed and job guarantee workers now, do they find it as real employment under the job guarantee? We find that so far the workers in the job guarantee are very happy not to be unemployed anymore. So they perceive it as not to be in unemployment anymore. But then so far they also differentiate between them working under the job guarantee and between the others who have real jobs. So I think going forward, it will be a very crucial point whether employed under the job guarantee perceive their job as a real job, also for all the latent benefits of employment that are associated with it. Second question to Anna. Yes, the rollout has started since last year and the program is going on. Training is very individualized. So what is crucial about the training, I think, in the job guarantee pilot that I presented is that it is offered directly at the premises of the job guarantee social enterprise. So unemployed are first invited to this training period of 8 weeks. And that is with all the conditions as normal active labor market policies in Austria. So unemployed essentially are have the need to participate in order to continue receiving the benefits. And only afterwards there is the, which is the case for all the trainings assigned by the Public Employment Service. And after that, there is the offer, do you want to start an employment contract, which is entirely voluntary without strings attached. And what is really striking, then almost all the unemployed who participate in the training want to participate. So we believe it may be very crucial that unemployed already make the experience at the social enterprise to see what's going on, to get to know the people they can be working with in the future, to have this very close interaction between the preparatory training and the employment offer. And this result of take-up being so high, almost no non-compliance with the treatment is really striking, and I think is an interesting result by itself. A third question by Mito, whether it also applies to refugees and migrants. So the condition is that everyone who is a resident in the municipality is eligible, irrespective of the citizenship. So in fact, up to a third of the long-term unemployed have a migration background. And I know that some also have a refugee background, in fact. In the Austrian labor market, pending asylum seekers are not permitted to work, but those who have an asylum status approved are eligible and are also participating, and there are some among them. Last question by Jay, whether there is an indication of the participation would be associated with longer absence from market employment? Well, first, empirically, to answer this question, we'll have to wait for longer time results. But what is important from the outside of the program is that the motivation for the job guarantee program is that while for some, hopefully for many long-term unemployed, the best available trainings and activation policies can bring them back into market employment, we see that irrespective of how good the active labor market policy is, for some long-term unemployed, it is sheer impossible to integrate them stable in market employment. And so the question arises from that, what to do with them, right? Should they be punished or forced to participate in trainings or in activation policies while they're actually unable to find a job? Or should some social policy be targeted at them to improve their conditions and possibly even enable them to contribute to society and to the community? And that is the motivation for the job guarantee program. So market employment is being supported by the trainings in the preparatory phase and during the job guarantee program, but it is not the ultimate objective, and it is not what the success or failure of the policy will be measured on. Right, the success will be measured on, is it able to improve the living and working conditions of the participants? Of course, it is a challenge how to distinguish who is able to find market employment and who is not, to distinguish between the two groups. But so in our program, the approach is that everyone is being offered a job, and then everyone is being, of the long-term unemployed, is being supported to find market employment, but without pressure. Without the need and without that it's seen as an ultimate objective. Lastly, I'm going to share with you a summary of our preliminary results online, and I'm done with my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lucas. And sorry for the pressure, but we need to hand back afterwards. But first, Kate, you have the last word in our session before we hand back to Michael and Samuel and for the last session.
In the interest of time, I'll waive my last word and give it straight back to Michael. Thanks for the comments in the chat.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you so much, Lucas. It was a very interesting session. And with that, Michael, we'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, Kate, and Lucas, and much appreciated that Kate, that we gave us a bit time to catch up. So I'm not gonna be long. I'm gonna, without further ado, hand over to Sam Asfaha, who's chairing this, moderating this next session. We found Paul, and I'm delighted to have him here. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon to all of you, and good morning to you, Paul. I know it's early in the morning for you. So without much ado, just for the sake of time, let me go straight to this panel. Thanks, Paul, once again for making it early. Despite the long time difference that we have, I also want to thank the previous panelists. I think it's very interesting discussions, very rich, and I was very quietly listening, and it's quite insightful and enriching. And in many ways, it also connects us with what Paul is going to talk to us this morning for him, this afternoon for us in Geneva. So Paul is going to be touching a very important issue, which he called also I like the wording he used, which is the first order policy question, which is what is the impact of public employment services on income and poverty. But he goes beyond that issue in what I may dare to call an augmented first order policy question, because he tries to untangle the various mechanisms through which this income and employment effects of public employment services would be affected. He's in particular looking at the economy-wide effect, so the partial and general equilibrium impact. In other words, he's not looking into the direct impact associated with the public employment interventions, but looking at the spillover effects that are associated with this. So both the demand effect to be more precise, and also looking at how the public employment program interventions are impacting the private labor market, and what kind of impact they would have, and what is the extent of the impact that is seen on the income and employment opportunities generally in the treated areas associated by the direct impact, but also by the indirect general equilibrium impact. It's a very, I found that to be a very fascinating research. I read your research, Paul, which you co-authored. It's titled General Equilibrium Effects of Improving Public Employment Programs. And again, the other innovative part of the paper is you're looking at the efficiency effect or the improvement of these programs as such. And I think I found that to be quite innovative, and I think a great value addition to the literature and to the body of knowledge that we have generally on public employment services and on public programs in general, I think. And again, without preempting, I know you're going to tell us a lot, but again, I found your paper to be very useful in terms of our understanding of structural transformations or changes in the sectoral compositions of employment associated with policy. It takes about the impact of public programs also indirectly on stimulating the private sector through the impact it would have on demand or the goods and services that are demanded. And again, really fascinating. I mean, I read the whole 100+ page, so your tables. This is an area where I used to work in the past. I'm not so much doing that, but I still work on private sector related issues. So I find it quite rich, very interesting. We don't have a lot of time, Paul. So we will be crossing over the time limit that is given to us because if we go strictly by the agenda, we should be finishing in about 19 minutes. But that will not do justice to such a profound research, very sound, and I think with a great finding, great implications to our understanding. So I was chatting on the side with Michael, and he had allowed us to cross over a bit, and we hope that we're not going to lose many of our participants and the panelists. Please bear with us, and I'm sure you'll find this to be a very important discussion. So Paul Nijhaus is an economist, and he is an entrepreneur as well. He's an associate professor of economics at UC San Diego, and Paul is also a recipient of the Sloan Fellowship and has been named top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. Paul, I envy you very much, and you're really a distinguished scholar, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. So Paul holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University, and he's affiliated with a number of research hubs and research institutions, including the National Bureau for Economic Research. I understand also the Abdul Latif Jamal Poverty Action Lab. That's what I thought the J Lab stands for. Paul, you can correct me. He also is a co-founder, former president, and a current chair of a Give Directly. That's a national, I think that's an international NGO. And when I saw what that NGO does in terms of a number of issues related to digital cash transfers and so on, I think I was able to connect with the research that you have done in terms of the efficiency by introducing some kind of smart payment system in the Indian National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So without much ado, Paul, let me open the floor to you, and you have about 20 minutes to tell us your findings, your research, and about the general equilibrium effects that you found in the Indian National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and in particular in the actions that was done to increase efficiency of implementation. Thank you, Paul. And the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Samuel. You guys hear me okay? Yeah, Sam, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Paul.
Good.
We hear you, Paul.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's great to be with you all, and especially thankful that we were able to sort out the time zone confusions this morning, and grateful for the flexibility. So I'm glad that this still works out. Really looking forward to chatting with you guys. I want to get right into it. We're tight on time. So as Sam mentioned, this is a joint work with Karthik and with Sandeep. And really sort of one of the biggest projects we've worked on together in our decade plus of examining India's social protections system, and one that's really changed our thinking a lot on sort of the design of that system. So let me get right into it. I think framing for this, can I get to frame this and then get into some development, impact evaluation, development economics, and then hopefully kind of bring it back to the big picture again at the end. You all know the sort of importance and the significance of public workfare programs. And so I won't dwell on that point. I'll just mention that the NREGS in particular, which has already come up a bit in Kate's comments, and thank you, Kate, by the way, I think that sort of really frames very well some of the issues that I want to talk about here. But just the sheer significance of this program on its own is sort of mind-boggling, because India is so big and everybody in rural parts of India is eligible for this, and so that means it ends up covering around 11% of the world's population. And so, both for what we can learn about this for other settings, but also in and of itself, this is a very important program. And when we debate the impacts of these programs, I think what we're typically interested in and debating is how they impact the economy more broadly. So, we certainly care about sort of what happens to an individual when they have the opportunity to participate in a program like that. And to a large extent, we can see that by sort of looking at how much they participate, how much they earn. And if we want, we could also do some evaluation to understand the counterfactual to that. What would they have done if they hadn't been participating in the program? And so how much on net are they benefiting from the existence of it? But I think that the sort of people aren't really debating those issues so much. I think the kind of core things that we care about and worry about or feel excited about, as some of Kate's comments reflected, are, what could this do to markets if we would introduce an enormous program at this scale? And there are sort of a pessimistic view, which is that this could be very distortionary, right? We could drive up wages, bid people away from private sector jobs where they might have been more productive, and instead we're giving them this sort of make work stuff to do in the public sector that isn't really as valuable. And so on net, we're actually reducing the value created by labor. And then there's a much more positive view that says, well, actually, we need this as a disciplinary device. We think that it's a good idea to have a wage floor, to have a minimum wage. We think that markets aren't sufficiently competitive on their own, and this is a way of introducing some more of that competition and some of that discipline into them. And actually, we're more optimistic about the sorts of things that get created through these programs. We think some of these assets that get built could be quite productive and quite value enhancing. So there's that potential productivity channel, right? If we create things that are of value, those could be important public goods, things like roads or irrigation structures. There's the pure demand channel, right? So we're shipping a lot of money into these remote, relatively rural areas where, a lot of economists, myself included, increasingly think that just the absence of significant demand is one of the major constraints to growth and development. And then there's this labor market channel, right? What happens when you introduce a big new player in the market for low-skilled workers that's going to put upward pressure on wages? So I sort of see these as the kind of key things that development economists and sort of policymakers need to understand empirically in order to be able to make good decisions. And these are also things that have been hard for us to learn about. And so I won't go into the details here, but some of this just has to do with the availability of data and sort of the timing of it and the variables that are in it. Just haven't really been able to do a great job of sort of nailing the overall impacts on the big outcomes that we care about, like people's income and poverty. Second is identification, right? So this is sort of economist jargon for like, we actually know what the impacts are, or are we getting it wrong because there are biases in the statistics that are hard to tease out. And so, in a nutshell here, what work on the NREGS in the past has done has taken advantage of the program rollout, right? The fact that it was sort of introduced in some districts before others, which creates a sort of quasi-experiment or natural experiment. And so I think there's been some things that we've learned from that. There are also some limitations to that. And in particular, one of the things that hasn't been fully addressed is the sort of very basic point that, if this thing actually is having profound impacts on markets, we shouldn't expect those effects to be limited to within districts, right? If a neighboring district is treated, then that should impact my outcomes as well. And so in this project, we'd like to be able to get at that. And then the last issue, and this is sort of one of the ones that over the years we've come to think is especially important, is what we call construct validity, right? And what we mean by this is when we say we're looking at the impacts of the program, what do we really mean? What is the program? Because in the early years of the NREGS, as everybody knows, it's very well documented now, there was sort of enormous confusion. In some places, we're doing a pretty good job of implementing it. Some places really weren't doing anything at all. In some places, lots of people were working and getting money. In some places, most of the money was getting stolen. And so there's just sort of a lot of variation, and it's a bit difficult to look at that rollout and say, that's the impact of the program, because the program isn't any one thing, right? There's sort of a lot of variation in how well it's implemented. And so in this project, what we're going to do is sort of try to turn that weakness into a strength by saying, let's look precisely at the impacts of improving the quality of program implementation, because ultimately that's really what we're talking about, is sort of not going from 0 to 1, but going from less well implemented to better well implemented, and then asking what are the consequences of that. So we did that as part of this large scale experiment that we ran with the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. And so it was Andhra Pradesh at the time. It's since split into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, but at the time it was still the unified state of Andhra Pradesh. And Andhra Pradesh was in the midst of this very ambitious reform that they introduced to try to improve the performance of the NREGS. And the way they did this was by reforming the payment mechanism, the way in which people got paid. And so there are various implementation issues, but I think this was, they correctly identified this as probably the core thing to focus on first. And so they moved from a model in which payments were distributed largely through post offices, and people would sort of sign for them or not sign for them, as the case may be, to one in which there were business correspondents located in each community who would distribute the payments and who would authenticate people using biometric technology. So people would scan their fingerprints to prove that they were the person who had actually worked on the program and earned the money. And so the unique opportunity that we had here was to randomize the order in which the government rolled out this reform in the last 8 districts of the state to get it. So sort of at a relatively mature phase when the technology and the process was well understood. And also to randomize that at a very large scale. And so I'm showing you this map here to show you that we're doing this at the sub-district level. And a sub-district here is typically on average going to be around 62,000 people. So we're taking these very large units. And when we conduct the experiment at that scale, what that means is that we're potentially going to be able to see not just the impacts on individual people who now have access to a more reliable way of getting paid after they've worked, but also on the entire towns, communities, markets in which they live. We have one paper that looks at the sort of first stage of this, what were the impacts on the program performance and implementation itself. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but you need to know something about it for context and be able to interpret what comes next. And so I'd say the key things to know here are that, first on a whole bunch of metrics, just about everything that we thought of, it was very clear that this improved program implementation. And fortunately also did not seem to make it harder for people to get access to work in the first place. And that was a concern we had, because we thought, if you make it harder for people to steal from the program, they may just bother less with implementing it in the first place. But that doesn't seem to have been the case here. So on all these measures, performance improved. And then if you just ask people, which do you prefer, the new way or the old way? Overwhelmingly, people said that they prefer this new mechanism for getting paid. So it seems very clear that this was a beneficial reform. This didn't change the amount of money that was actually flowing sort of as part of the program into these areas. So it changed who got the money. There was less corruption and there was more money going to the actual workers, but it didn't change government outlay. And so that's sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind here, that we're going to be looking at the effects of an intervention that was, essentially costless from the government's point of view. And so then we think because of that, we can interpret the results as sort of being the impacts of significantly improving not the presence de jure, but the presence de facto of the NREGS on the ground. All right, so in the paper, we have some cool technical stuff, which if you're interested in this sort of program evaluating work and sort of thinking about impacts on markets and prices and things like that might be of interest to you. What I think you need to know for the purposes of our conversation today is essentially that we're not just going to look at what happens within one of these sub-districts when NREGS improves there, but also at what happens in the neighborhood around it. And so we're going to develop spatial econometric techniques to try to take that into account and to capture it and correct for it. And one of the things we're going to see when we look at some of the results is that in some cases that ends up mattering quite a bit, right? So you don't want to just think of these sub-districts or these towns as being little islands that don't interact with each other. They do, they're all part of a big market economy. And so it's important to take the role of space into account if we want to get a comprehensive estimate of the impacts that we have. So let me start with the income gains. And I think if there's sort of one big thing for you to take away from the paper, it's going to be this result. Because the core result here is, and I'll ask you just focus here on the top row, if you will, of numbers. These are sort of the total estimated impact, including both the direct impact of being in a treated area and then also the neighborhood effect of being surrounded by other treated areas. So, our estimate of the total impact of improving NREGS implementation on people's total earnings from all sources, including NREGS, but also from market and self-employment sources, It's quite big. That's in the first column. So you see that's a sort of roughly 10,000 rupee increase on a base of around 70. So this is, sort of around a 13% increase in people's earnings in a representative sample of NREGS participants. And then the thing that's really striking about that is that, as you see in columns 2 and 3, where we break that down, right, a little bit of that is coming directly from NREGS earnings, but actually the great majority of it is not, right? The great majority of it is coming from their market earnings. So we have this big increase in income, but if we were just looking at what people got from the program itself, we'd be understating it by a factor of around 10, right? We'd be really missing the big part of the picture, which is not just what the program is doing directly, but what it's doing indirectly to markets. And to labor markets in particular, right? So we really want to dig in and understand what is it that's happening with wage labor. It turns out what's happening with wage labor is, first that wages are going up. And so you see that here in column 2. Column 2 are actual market wages that people earn. Column 1 is people's reservation wage. So that's how much do they say they'd be willing to work for. And so you can think of that as a measure of how strong they feel their bargaining position and their outside options are when they enter into the workforce. So, we feel like we're sort of essentially shifting up the labor supply curve here in this setting. But then the thing that's really interesting is that, even though wages are going up, in a competitive labor market, we would expect that, all else equal, that means employment is going to be going down because employers are going to be willing to hire fewer people at the higher wage. But that's not what's happening, right? So if you look in column 3, you see that people are spending less time in self-employment, not working. And then in 4 and 5, you see some of that is because they are working more on the NREGS, but some of it is because they're actually working more in the private sector in column 5. And so that's then the next key piece of the puzzle, because the reason that we see these big income gains in the previous table is precisely because here, it's not just wages going up while employment goes down. It's both of them going up together in tandem. And so then the next big task in the paper for us is going to be to try to understand that and say, why is it that these two things are increasing together in tandem, which is sort of the opposite of this concern that a lot of people have had, right? That we're going to crowd out productive employment in the private sector. I won't say much about this in the interest of time, just to say that, we kind of focus on this particular part of the year, which is sort of relatively less busy, when the NREGS is very active and there's less activity in the agricultural sector. But to the extent we can say anything about it, it actually seems like the impacts we see here are pretty persistent year round. And it's not as if this is a time of year when employment is very slack, right? So the last panel here shows you how much work people are doing in total quarterly throughout the year from a separate survey. You see, this is actually a time of the year when people are working pretty active, right? So it's not as if this is a time when there are a lot of people just sitting around with nothing to do. Cool. So then the next thing we're going to do is move from our own survey data to a census. So fortunately for us, the government conducted a census of income and a few other basic demographic characteristics at around the same time. And so now we can look not just at people who are participating in the program and in our survey, but at the entire population. And so here again, we see, and here income is just measured categorically, so it's a very coarse measure, but we see that there's a significant reduction in the number of people that are in the lowest income category, and then movement into the higher income brackets, especially the middle income bracket, right? So this is sort of just really striking that we're seeing this significant, it's like a 3 percentage point reduction in sort of a measure of poverty, if you will, as a result of this reform, which was just improving payments, right, within the public employment scheme. Another census that we're able to draw on, and this is sort of really nice because this is now going to take us a bit more outside of the agricultural sector, is the economic census, which is a census the government conducts of firms in the non-agricultural sector. So it counts the number of firms, and it also counts the number of employees working in those firms. And so again, keep in mind that we're in a setting here where we've seen wages rising. And so the sort of simple textbook definition or sort of prediction here would be that employment is going to be falling. We see again that there's this significant increase in employment and also in the number of enterprises. And to give you a sense of what these numbers mean, this is a huge movement in the adult workforce out of primarily agriculture, right, what most people are doing before, into the non-agricultural sector. So this would be sort of equivalent to about 10 years of movement from agricultural into non-agricultural at the pace at which structural change has been proceeding in India. So you're seeing this big increase in employment, and you're also seeing this acceleration of structural change, right, where people move out of agriculture and into non-agricultural employment. Last thing we check here is prices. So I mean, one question you might have is, if wages are going up, does that mean there's also upward pressure on the prices of consumer goods, things that people are paying for? And so that would not be a crazy thing to see, but that doesn't seem to be what we see here, right? If anything, when we look at prices, it seems like there's maybe a slight decrease, although none of these things are significant. So we're not seeing inflationary pressure as a result of this. But what we are seeing is that, the couple of measures that we can try to look at the rates of return to land, right? So I've shown you wages, which are like the rates of return to labor. Now I'm going to look at land. And if we look at the profits people earn from their own land, or if we look at the price they think they could get if they sold their land, both of those things are decreasing pretty substantially. And in the case of profits, it's actually significant. Right? So we get a significant reduction in profit there. And so you put these things together, and I'll talk a bit more about this, but what this really looks like is a significant redistribution, right, away from the owners of land, which is, of course, one of the most important forms of capital in this economy, and towards the owners of labor. We take those estimates and then we sort of say a distributional exercise, and we say, okay, well, let's take what we know about how much labor and how much land everybody in this economy owns, and then take the impacts we've just seen and sort of net it all up and say who's gaining and who's losing from this change. And so, we think there are some losers, but if you look here at panel C at our sort of estimates of the net impact on people's earnings, it's really only out here in the right tail, the very wealthiest people, the very largest landowners, that we think that on net, this is a loss. So, distributionally, our best estimate here is that there are a handful of very large landowners who own so much land that this is causing them a net reduction in income. But there are a lot of people who own just labor, right, who know no land at all. Those are the 0 acres guys. And then a lot of people who own a little bit of land, but not a whole bunch, for whom this is on net a positive thing. Cool. So we then think a little bit in the paper about sort of how to interpret all of these numbers I've shown you, and sort of what does it teach us about the structure of the underlying economy. And so we think about that in 2 steps. I think the first is sort of how did this initial impulse of improving the NREGS, how did this lead both wages and employment to rise together? Right? I said that's sort of a counterintuitive prediction if you thought that these were competitive labor markets and that nothing else was changing. And so, we do a few things in the paper to try to get at this. I think the first set of explanations, maybe a simple way of thinking about this, maybe workers just got more productive because you're creating public assets, or maybe the workers themselves are, better nourished or better skilled. And so they're able to produce more value per hour that they work. Right? And that would be one way of explaining this pattern of both higher wages and higher employment. It's really hard to tell that story using our data, right? To the extent that we have measures of human capital, like how well nourished people are, whether they're doing any skilled labor that they might be learning, picking up skill from, that's just really not the case. There have subsequently been some efforts to try to introduce a skilling component into the NREGS, but just at the time, everybody's doing very unskilled, moving rocks and digging dirt, things like that. And then quantitatively, if we try to think about the impacts of the capital that's formed, even under a generous assumptions, right, we think this is explaining a very small portion of the impacts that we're seeing. And then the second point here is that reduction I showed you in the returns to land ownership, that in itself is going to be hard to reconcile with any productivity-based story, right? So it's hard to tell a story where workers are getting more productive and that makes landowners worse off, right? Because if the people you're hiring are more productive, that's generally going to be beneficial to you. So we think it's really hard to tell any of these productivity-based stories. And we do find, what we find is the pretty compelling evidence that there's a lot of employer market power here, meaning that employers are not paying a competitive wage, right? They're paying a depressed wage because they have some power over workers in this setting. And so we do an exercise, for example, where we look at how the impacts are different in places where land holdings are more concentrated. And we see that the wage gains are going to be concentrated in those areas. They're larger in those areas. So, net, this really looks to us like a setting, sort of like the famous studies of the minimum wage that some of you may be familiar with, where, you can increase wages and actually increase employment with them in tandem because the labor markets were not all that competitive to begin with. So I think that's kind of key message number one. And then the second thing we do is we try to think about, well, then what would be the broader impacts, once these labor markets, primarily these are agricultural labor markets, once you see an increase in output there, how will that then impact the rest of the economy, the non-agricultural sector, all these sorts of things? And here, honestly, I think there's less we can do with the data that we have at hand. But one thing we can say, which I think is interesting and noteworthy, is that when you look at what people did with this money, right, there's very little impact on sort of financial savings. So people are saving to some extent by acquiring livestock, things like that. They're also spending some money on food, things like that. But all of the money they're getting, we think they're essentially all of it they're spending locally on something, whether it's a consumption good or an asset. And so what that means is that this represents a really big demand shock to the local economy, right? That the demand for locally produced stuff is going to go up by quite a bit. And so we think that's probably part of what explains that pattern I showed you when we looked at the non-agricultural enterprises, right? And that's actually consistent with some other work that's been done recently that shows that, somewhat surprisingly, when the agricultural sector in India is doing well, that actually benefits the non-agricultural sector locally, despite the fact that wages are higher. And so we think that's because these small, and these are very small, right? These non-agricultural businesses, they're typically 1 or 2 people working at them. They're really dependent on local demand for their business, right? They're not exporting stuff to other parts of the country, to other parts of the world. And so when local people have more disposable income, more money to spend, that stimulates the non-agricultural sector. Okay. So I will then bring us back to sort of some big picture takeaways, and then would love to get into a discussion and hear your thoughts. So, what do we take away from all of this for policymaking? I think the first is, and as Michael mentioned and as Sam mentioned, I'm heavily involved in sort of direct cash transfers to people. I think those are great. I think we should do more of them. But relative to a strategy of simply giving people money, this certainly shifts our priors and makes us think that an employment guarantee scheme could be attractive and cost effective, precisely because it seems like there are these significant imperfections in labor markets that the EGS is helping to address. And so, I think the role of those labor market imperfections and the role of local demand multipliers, which is something that I've gotten at also in other work in Kenya, which is the Egger et al. Site here, where we find very large demand multipliers to transfers in Kenya. Those things both suggest a significant role for policies like this. The second is just sort of the political economy of this, right? If you think about that distributional picture I showed you, you got a lot of people that are benefiting from a reform like this and should be willing to support it and to support politicians that introduce it. But you do have a handful of people that are hurt. And by the way, that is a very politically connected, powerful handful of people with a lot of clout. And it's sort of pretty well documented fact, right? That there is a significant opposition to the NREGS from large landowners in rural India, precisely, we think, because they benefit from low wages and even from wage volatility. And then I think the third point, and this is sort of near and dear to us because we spent so much of our careers working on corruption and on improving program implementation, is just how big the costs of weak implementation and corruption can be. Right? So it'd be easy to look at this program and say, well, maybe 10–20% of the budget is getting siphoned off, and so that's the cost, right? But that would actually massively understate the cost of weak implementation and corruption in this setting, because as we've seen here, plugging those gaps then has really big multiplier impacts on the economy around the program, right? Not just in the program itself, right? And so I think, to us, this encouraged us, it reminded us not to take a narrow view of the costs of weak implementation, because if the bulk of the impact of these programs is their indirect effect on markets, then the bulk of the costs of weak implementation, corruption, are going to be reduced impacts on local markets as well. So I'd highlight those as sort of 3 key themes to take away as we go think about policies elsewhere. And then I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Sam, to moderate, and look forward to your thoughts and questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think very powerful presentation, and with some strong findings from your research. And I already see that Kate commenting how amazing this research is, and I do agree. And Kate, thank you for alluding to that. Without much ado, for the sake of time, let me open the floor for questions. So if there are any questions, either from the other panelists that are sitting here, or from the wider audience. If not, I'll be posing some questions to Paul. But let me hear first from the audience. So you can raise your hands, or you can type in the Q&A chat. I
have a question, Sam, if nobody else.
Michael, please, yes, come in.
Thanks, and thanks a lot, Paul, for your. For me, one of the most fascinating parts. I mean, there are many fascinating parts of the work, but one is this, this kind of cost of corruption, or the cost of inefficient implementation that came out. And I was just wondering if for me, there is a huge rate of return on introducing the smart cards, for instance. And I think, but there's a cost to that as well. And I don't know if at any point you looked at it, like what was the cost of introducing this mechanism that improves the implementation? Because this is a strong argument for, actually, from an operational side, investing in better implementation, which is often a issue that's not, the benefits of that are not always enough appreciated or thought through. So I was just checking if it's something you looked at in the paper.
Great. Yeah, we do actually more of that in the first paper, which was sort of the the kind of program evaluation of the impacts on the scheme. And so exactly as you inferred, we sort of come to the conclusion that it's very sort of, even under conservative assumptions, it's sort of clearly a cost-effective reform. In some sense, and we debated this a lot because we sort of had some of these market results as well at the time. That's only a partial accounting of the full costs and benefits, because there's also this enormous redistribution, right, that's happening in the private sector markets as well. And so if you took that into account, those effects are going to dwarf, even the costs and benefits within the narrow confines of the program itself. So I guess the thing I'd say, though, just tell a little bit of story around it too, Michael, that sort of, I think your comment raises is, this reform, despite the fact that it seems to have been very cost effective, nearly got scrapped. So there was a point partway through the study where there was a lot of pushback coming up to the top level, to the chief minister's office, from people. And, essentially the sorts of objections would be that, hey, there are people that are not able to use this new system, elderly people whose thumbprints don't scan, things like that. And so there's exclusion and harm, and we really need to shut this thing down. And so, I think there is a little bit of that, right? But the overwhelmingly, as you've seen, people supported the program. And I think that really what was happening here is you have people who have lost out, whose rents are being cut out by this reform, that are then using these examples as a way of trying to push back. And so, this was a case where to be honest, it's not even the impact evaluation we done, but literally just the survey where we said, what fraction of people like it, was helpful, I think, in convincing the government that this was worth keeping. And so I think that was an important lesson, right? That it's sort of very easy to pick stories and tell a story about what impact a reform like this is having to suit your interests and to argue a particular political case, and very useful to have a sort of, incredibly neutral third party that's looking at the numbers and giving you a biased estimate.
Let me ask you one question, Paul. So the issue is India different from other developing countries, or to what extent this can be replicated, or we will be able to find similar results if we could do the same kind of interventions to improve the efficiency of public employment programs in other developing countries? Because much of the effect that we saw here is due to the demand side effect mainly,
right?
If I understood correctly. And this is because, there's a number of factors. One is the structure of the labor market is quite critical, and I think it determines the extent of the spillover effect that would exist. But also the spending behavior of the beneficiaries also. If they could save much of the additional income, then of course we wouldn't see a huge impact. So perhaps the result could be reversed, and we might be able to see the wage levels increasing, maybe because of the reservation wage, but maybe the economy will not be stimulated enough for the demand effect to exceed the cost that is associated due to the higher wage. So probably we would have seen what we would expect classically: wage goes up and employment goes down. But maybe here we've got a stronger demand effect. But the question is, this stronger demand effect, or this general economy multiplier effect, as we know, the magnitude of that is determined by a number of factors, including how connected these different labor markets or economies are. So, for example, if the beneficiaries were to spend their money as they did, instead of on the local economy, if they do it on other districts or other imports from other countries, then we would have seen a big leakage. Hence, the multiplier would have been smaller. So the issue is, I'm just thinking about other developing countries, and again, what do you think? From the research that you've done, of course, your study was limited to India, but would you expect to get the same results in other developing countries context as well?
Yeah, good. The chief academic answer is always, well, we need to do more research. And so, of course, we need to do more research. But, well, I guess what I'd say is, first, I think that one way in which India is somewhat unusual is, most developing countries, need to invest in their capacity to implement programs like this. And so, that's a commonality. But, India is really sort of an outlier in terms of having democratized at a very low level of income and with very limited state capacity. And so, if you sort of look at, I think, any plausible measure of India's capacity to implement programs like this compared to its ambitions in terms of how much redistribution it wants to do, it's really stark. And so, I think of India as a place where the returns to this sort of, very bread and butter sort of, improvement in capacity, something very simple, right, to be able to pay people. I think of India as a place where things like this are probably going to be unusually valuable. I don't think that the other sorts of things, you touched, for example, on what people do with their money. I think that in most of the sort of low income settings that I work, and, that many of us care about, people are spending and saving, but saving still takes the same sorts of forms, that they're purchasing livestock or other assets they might be. So, I think they're not putting money into an intermediate financial account, which then ends up in the New York Stock Exchange, right? So, and that's sort of the distinction that matters in terms of, are we going to get these demand multipliers? So I'd expect to see that to look pretty similar in most places. And then the thing that I'd really be excited to see us focus on is sort of good measurement of labor market power, right, of employer market power in more of these settings. Because we're able to get at that somewhat indirectly with this interaction effect, but certainly I've come away thinking like, boy, I should really try to get a better sense of that in more of the places we work. And so there are other techniques and diagnostics that we have available. And that I think is really the first order thing that comes out of this for me, is that that would be invaluable information for deciding where to prioritize a scheme like this or improvements to a scheme like this.
Thanks, Paul. Just one more question, I think, while we're waiting for other questions, if they're going to pop up. But I think another very important issue in the context of many developing countries, but also certainly in India, is the issue of informality. And I think it would be interesting also to understand the impact that public employment programs would have also as part of the discussion of structural transformation in terms of facilitating, the transition to formality. So one of the things that I was trying to look at your paper, which is a secondary issue, given the purpose of your research is to look at the impact in terms of the general equilibrium in terms of income and employment. But it will be interesting if a distinction could be made in terms of those jobs that are created in the non-agriculture sector, in the private sector, by distinguishing them, to what extent they are in the formal private sector rather than in the informal sector. And again, the reserve wages might be different, what we have in formal and informal sector as well. So again, the extent that the public work program could really raise up the wage floor in the formal sector could also be something worthy looking at. But from perhaps you might have touched on this issue on the side as you do this research.
Could I react? Could I react to that, Sam? Because I think it's a great point. And my version of this is essentially that we think we know what these programs cost because we look at the accounts, but we actually don't. In the sense that a big scheme like this is going to have fiscal impacts on many other parts of government, because of the causal effects of the program that we're not seeing yet. And so I think informality, impacts on informality are one example of that, right? Where you might see transitions there, and that's going to have an impact on tax revenue. But there are many others. Sort of the NREGS is a great example where any program in India that impacts how destitute people are and how much demand there is for NREGS employment, that's going to have an impact on the state budget that we're not currently pricing in when we say what's the cost of some new policy. So I think of that as sort of one of the kind of key frontiers for all of this work, is to really get a better understanding of what is the true cost of a new program once you take these fiscal interactions into account, and sort of formality and informality be one of the margins through which that works.
Thanks, Paul. Is there any other question or anybody who wants to come in? Mito, you switched off your camera, so maybe you're coming in.
I'm supposed to do the closing, Sam.
All right, so I think we can stop here, maybe, so that we give you the chance for the sake of time. Also, Paul, it's really interesting, but I think the takeaway for me is that the general equilibrium effect does matter, and efficiency of those public employment programs are extremely critical. They are as important as the program itself, and these are the two takeaways we're taking with us. Thank you, Paul, for a very rich and insightful presentation. So back to you, Mito.
Very well said.
Right, great. Thanks a lot, Paul and Sam, for moderating this excellent session. So, and thanks for those who have stuck with us. We run a bit over. Some of you had to go, but that's unfortunately how it went. But so I'm gonna pass over then to the closing to Mito, who's the chief of the Development Investments branch here at ILO. We will close this webinar, So Mito, let me hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. So we're now at the closing of the workshop, and I'm very conscious of time. So, we really do appreciate those of you who have stuck with us. But I was asked to summarize what we covered over the 2 days, which is almost an impossible task. But I hope you'll agree with me that, it's been a really informative and extremely insightful 2 days. I'm sure that we could have spent, weeks discussing each of these fabulous presentations. I mean, each presentation warrants a day of debate, and I'm sorry that we weren't able to do that, and maybe for the next time. But it's really great that so many of you participated, and at peaks, I think we had over 115 participants. And given the attendance and the interest that we're starting to see, we really hope that we'll be able to continue to make this an annual event. And we hope that many of you will be able to present your new or continued research next year. And the discussion just now with Sam and Paul, you guys mentioned continued research. So we certainly hope to see you back here again next year. So before actually closing and thanking everyone, I just really wanted to take us back, to go back to the 3 key questions that were originally asked by Sang-Hyun, if you remember, for those of you who were with us at the beginning of the webinar yesterday. And the 3 questions were, how can public employment programs help to speed up the recovery? The second question was, how can they help make the recovery more equitable? And the third one, which was, how can they make the recovery more transformative? Yesterday, we saw that that public employment programs have played a key role in helping economies recover for the past 100 years, if not more, and that there are striking similarities with the way or why the ILO engaged in public works in the first place, mainly to address mass unemployment, peace, and social justice. Some of the things that were mentioned, which I thought it was interesting to highlight, unemployment and poverty are key drivers for conflict. We're seeing more conflict these days, so I think that's something that is important to retain. Full employment, something that many of us have been promoting, is something that was promoted as early as the 1940s. Also, something that we discussed, especially in the Q&A session, was the role of the government. What is the role of the government as an employer of last resort, especially for countries where the countries themselves are not creating sufficient formal jobs? So that was something that was discussed. But I think a really important point, and this is something I'd like you to take away with you, is that it's not just the quantity of jobs, but it's the quality of jobs that is important. And that is really essential when we're talking about a human-centered recovery. So going back to the 3 questions, first on the recovery, several of the presentations highlighted the wider economic effects, but also other effects like the environmental ones, like IUCN had presented, and different spillovers of these programs. And these effects may actually be even larger than we thought. And while we have always known that these programs have an important multiplier effect, the paper on India presented today by Paul really challenges us to think whether such effects could be present in other contexts as well, and whether we have generally been underestimating these effects, which in turn has important implications for speeding up the recovery. Second, on equitable recovery, through the various examples over the 2 days, we also saw that there were PEPs that can really transform the lives of individuals and even communities who participate, whether it's through their psychosocial well-being, such as the examples we saw today on the Rohingya refugee camp, and also the examples of France, and helping them make a contribution to society and addressing many of the social ills that exist in the societies that they live in. So PEPs should be able to ensure that the recovery is more equitable. The presentation from yesterday and today, I really believe, showcased the intrinsic value of work and really demonstrating what I think is important and has been highlighted by the ILO as a human-centered recovery, but also one that is contributing to the humanitarian development, and if designed well, also the peace nexus. So third, on the speed of the recovery, we have also seen that by directing these programs more broadly, but also to other sectors, such as the green and care sectors, as we saw yesterday on the Pakistan case on the 10 billion trees, but also the South African case on the care economy, they can certainly support the transformation in these sectors and ensure that there is a just transition, whether through enhancing resilience or supporting transitions to formality. So then, what about the future? Where do we go from here? I think today Kate's presentation questioned the future of work and technological change. And many of the presentations also showcased how job opportunities through public employment programs can contribute to productive activities in different sectors, can also provide skills, dignity from the work offered, and with also the potential to address multiple challenges. I think Kate also mentioned this too, the challenges which are economic, social, and environmental at the same time. The presentation also today on the Austrian job guarantee highlighted the important task ahead of us to be able to address unemployment, social inclusion, health and well-being, and that together we need to ensure that the benefits and the impact of public employments are known, and to make these programs part of a social contract where they can play the vital role of really ensuring that no one is left behind. And finally, we have seen that despite the many changes, there are many trade-offs in the world of work, but public employment programs, or PEPs, will remain as relevant as ever in both high income and low income settings, as we've seen through history. But I think also many of the presentations over the 2 days really highlighted sort of the past, but also the present. And on a personal level, I'm actually really excited to finally see this webinar materialize. I really thank all my colleagues, since many of us here today who have been present here today and yesterday have been promoting and working on these issues for many years, through the, especially in the ILO through the Employment Intensive Investment Program, but also now through our branch DevInvest. So what I think has clearly emerged from these 2 days is that the program can speed up the recovery, it can make it more equitable, and it can certainly contribute to a just transitions. And I think the various presentations over the 2 days clearly pointed this way. So I'd just like to end by leaving you with 3 words, if you could just keep these 3 words in mind. So what is it that the socioeconomic recovery should be about? And for me, the 3 words, or for us, the 3 words are fast, equitable, and transformative. It very much sounds like a title of a new movie. So let's make it a successful one. Let's make this possible for the sake of those who are the most vulnerable and who are still continuing to live in poverty. So with that, thanks to all of you. Thanks to those of you who are still here with us, and particularly all the speakers who presented the rich content over the 2 days. We certainly hope to continue the collaboration with you. The ITC ILO, and also our participants in our touring course who will be with us virtually for 6 weeks, working on around the activities of public employment programs, but also to all of you, the participants, for joining our webinar and for your interest. And so also just to maybe mention, I noticed that it was on the chat, all the papers, presentations, and recordings will be made available on the event website. So if you have any concerns or can't find that, please let us know. And otherwise, have a lovely weekend, and I hope to see you all again next year, if not sooner, and hopefully face to face. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody who's still here. And back to you, Michael. I don't know if you want to take the word.
No, I think we close here, Vito, but thank you very much for this closing. So everybody, thank you very much. ITC colleagues, we'll see you next week. And the rest, we'll see you soon. Thank you all, and have a nice weekend as well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.